Good morning and welcome to the 25th meeting of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee in 2025. I have received apologies for today's meeting from the convener, Claire Hockey, and Deputy Convener, Paul Sweeney. In the absence of a convener and Deputy Convener, I am required, as the oldest member of the committee present, to take the chair initially with a view to appointing a temporary convener for today's meeting. In this role, I propose to nominate myself as the temporary convener for today's meeting. Can I therefore ask members are content that I act as a temporary convener for the remainder of today's meeting? Content. Thank you. The first item on our agenda is for the committee to agree to take item 4 in private. Are members agreed? Thank you. The next item on our agenda is to take oral evidence from the first of 2 panels of witnesses as part of the committee's inquiry into ADHD and ASD pathways and support. Given that some of the witnesses we will be hearing from are themselves individuals with ADHD, autism or both, we have sought to make reasonable adjustments to support them in giving in evidence to the committee this morning. This includes providing the witnesses with questions we plan to ask in advance of the meeting. If anyone attending today's meeting needs to take a break at any point, please indicate this to myself or the clerks. I welcome to the committee Rob Holland, Director of National Autistic Society Scotland, Bill Coley, Chair of Scottish ADHD Coalition, and Danny Cosgrove, Chief Operating Officer, Stronger Together for Autism and Neurodivergence Stand, and Mark MacDonald, Media and Policy Officer, Scottish Autism. With that, we will move straight to questions, and Emma Harper.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to everybody. So this theme is about the role of diagnosis. So I am interested to hear from you what the impact that a diagnosis can have for a person with a neurodevelopmental condition such as autism or ADHD. I guess should I come to you first, Rob?
Yes, happy to go first, and thank you for the opportunity to give evidence today. Receiving a diagnosis is a validating and life-affirming experience for many people. It helps autistic people to understand themselves more, their identity, as well as the strengths and challenges that they face. People will often say to us that I thought something was wrong with me, that I was broken. And so a diagnosis can bring that reassurance and can start or help people on that journey to understanding themselves, as well as start to develop those strategies that they might need or seek out appropriate support. We also know that diagnosis can be a gateway to support as well, whether that's in education, employment, or within the social security system or within healthcare. That shouldn't be the case. Services and support should be available to those that don't have a diagnosis, but the reality is that public services are stretched, finances are under a huge amount of pressure, and sometimes support is prioritised or allocated based on a number of factors, diagnosis being one of those. And then the last point I'd like to make on this question is that there are a lot of very negative narratives out there about autism and the prevalence of autism. And there's that ongoing stigma and discrimination that people face, and people will say to us that they are not always believed that they're autistic by professionals in some circumstances. And so a diagnosis can be helpful, whether it's in education, whether it's in social care, whether it's in healthcare.
Okay, thank you for that. Not sure if anybody else has any comments on diagnosis. Mark?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. And I think there are a couple of things I would add. So we at Scottish Autism have a community advice line, which is a national service. And over the last 2 years, our advice line's had over 1,000 contacts regarding accessing an assessment. So I think there is definitely an importance attached to an assessment and diagnosis, and I think it links into what Rob was saying there. It's about an understanding of self. I think Rob is right when he talks about, and we'll probably get into this a little bit later, about the fact that need should be the centre of where support is derived, but people also have a right to understand from where that need itself is derived, and then diagnosis can support and assist in relation to that. And I just want to quote one of the responses we received to a survey that we did in partnership with a group of autistic people's organisations, some of whom you'll hear from in your next panel, when we were receiving evidence about why people attach an importance to an assessment and diagnosis. And one of the responses said, "It has allowed me to understand myself better, to support and advocate for myself. I'm in employment for the first sustained period ever, and I'm more comfortable with myself than I've ever been before." And I think that summarises the importance of a diagnosis to the individual.
Okay, thank you. And Bill?
Yeah, I think there's a critical difference between the ADHD population and those with ASD, although there's a huge overlap, as you'll be aware, in terms of comorbidity, particularly in that without diagnosis you can't get treatment. Now, there's no medical treatment for autism, but there is for ADHD, and it's shown to be very effective. So if young people or adults are not being given access to assessment and diagnosis, they're not getting treatment for a treatable condition. So that is a fairly significant difference between our two respective interest areas. But the other, I think, is the more sort of pragmatic. Well, one is the emotional side of things, that diagnosis can be part of a healing process, and I think that's what was being touched on, that you look back on your life and reflect, and some of the trauma that's been experienced can be explained and rationalised by the diagnosis. So it can be good about looking back as well as looking forward. But in terms of everyday life, then within the education system, within the criminal justice system, within the workplace, a knowledge and understanding that someone has ADHD can allow the employer, as well as the employee, or the school pupil, as well as the school teacher, to get a better understanding of what needs to be put in place. So it's pretty important.
Okay. Danny?
Thanks for inviting me today to speak on behalf of STAND and give me the opportunity to shine the light on the views of children and parents. We are a relatively new grassroots charity. I've not got much to add, to be honest. Most of my points were covered. But I do think it's important to recognise what a diagnosis is and how someone gets one. Diagnostic assessment for autism and ADHD identifies the best ways to address needs and how not to cause harm. And on top of that, to start treatment for ADHD, you require a diagnosis. I will add that when we surveyed parents and carers at the start of this year, almost 90% said it was vital to their child's well-being.
Okay, thanks. To what extent are neurodevelopmental conditions being over or even underdiagnosed in Scotland? Any thoughts about that? Mark?
Yeah, I think, and this perhaps leads on from Rob's point about harmful narratives, and I think there are harmful narratives out there right now regarding diagnosis and the concept of overdiagnosis. I think if we think in terms of autism, which is obviously the area in which Scottish Autism primarily works, autism was first diagnosed less than 100 years ago. That's not to say that autistic people didn't exist before that. They did, in the same way that America existed before Columbus stepped off the boat. We just recognise it now, we understand it, and our understanding has grown. And during the time that our understanding has grown, the thresholds for diagnosis have changed, and that has meant that people who historically would not have received a diagnosis are now able to achieve one. But what it also means is that we are playing catch-up in terms of diagnosis. So if you were to look at a distribution graph in terms of age profile, you would see a tail-off in terms of autism diagnosis beyond the ages of, say, 40 to 50. And that's because these are people who historically would not have met the thresholds and the criteria that existed 30, 40 years ago. And a lot of these people are now coming to understand that they perhaps do require an assessment and a diagnosis. And often that is triggered as a result of somebody in their life, often a child, achieving a diagnosis. And I think that leads me into probably one of the concerning elements around what's happening in terms of adult pathways at the moment, because we're seeing adult pathways being restricted and in some places closed. So at the point at which people are starting to come to understand themselves better and seek out that assessment and diagnosis, we see a system where that is becoming less possible for those people in some areas. And I think that potentially leads to difficulties being caused, people potentially having to go down a private diagnosis route, and we may come on to discuss some of the issues that arise as a result of that. But I think it's two things. I think that we are playing catch up. We have a better understanding of autism than we historically have done, and as our understanding has developed. And I think it's also that there has been historical underdiagnosis. So I don't think it's that there's overdiagnosis. I think that there in the past has been historical underdiagnosis, but that is just as a result of our understanding and knowledge around autism developing over time.
Okay, thanks. I think Bill, you, yeah.
Yes, just in terms of, I would echo everything that's been said so far about under-recognition in the more elderly population. We're talking about tiny figures. The data, the most recent data that we've found is for it's on 2019 figures, NHS figures of prescribing. It was in publication last year. And in terms of children, if we take a 5% prevalence, the range is usually between 5 and 7 that we work on. The figures are that 73%, 73% of children who have ADHD are not receiving treatment. And at a 7% estimate, it's 81%. So this rather counters the press narrative that it's being overdiagnosed. And when we look at adults, where the prevalence range is between 2 and 4%, then at 2%, 91% of adults with ADHD are not receiving treatment, and at the 4% level, it's 96%.
Okay.
So, given that ADHD is a treatable condition, then the vast majority of people have not been assessed and diagnosed and are therefore not receiving treatment.
Okay. And are there any specific groups that are more affected by missed or incorrect diagnosis?
Well, I think there are, certainly in the national guidelines, they identify any child going into the care system, for example, any young person entering the criminal justice system, young people who experience substance use disorder. We can bring in some of the concerns at the moment about vaping, because it's likely that the availability of a substance like nicotine in the environment is going to be attractive to someone who is trying to self-medicate. So you get these pathways of vulnerability feeding through, in particular in certain groups. So yes, that's universally recognised.
Okay.
We see, in fact, that all groups can be affected by missed or incorrect diagnosis, to be honest. Research shows particular groups such as are likely to be missed. For example, it's understood that girls are more likely to mask, and then they're far less likely to be identified as autistic or ADHD than boys. But on the whole, the children that we support are already so badly affected by the current state of affairs that it's difficult to distinguish between the varying degrees of harm and distress, and it's not something I'd be comfortable doing anyway. The most obvious group for us that is most likely to be missed or have a misdiagnosis is the huge cohort of children currently who require an assessment for autism and ADHD, but can't get access onto a waiting list because they don't have a co-occurring mental health condition.
Okay, thanks. Mark.
Yeah, you'll hear later from witnesses from CIMA and from SWAN, who I think can talk in more detail. But I think if we think about people from ethnic minority backgrounds and females, they tend to be the groups who are most prevalent when we talk about underdiagnosis or misdiagnosis or incorrect diagnosis in relation to autism. A lot of people receive diagnosis for things like borderline personality disorder, for schizophrenia, for eating disorders, before eventually receiving a diagnosis of autism. And I think that is obviously deeply problematic because you have people who are potentially being moved into treatment for conditions which they do not have, while at the same time not receiving the support regarding their autistic profile.
Okay.
Can you just add a little bit to that? In terms of the adult ADHD population, the majority of the figure that I described in terms of those not receiving treatment are being treated but for anxiety and depression rather than the underlying cause, which is the ADHD. So there is a cost to the NHS of ineffective medication in these groups.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. I'll leave it there, Convener.
Thank you. Carol Waffin.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I've got 3 questions, and the first one is around pathways and thresholds for assessment. So as part of the inquiry, the committee is also considering petition PE 2156, which describes a postcode lottery of access to pathways and support for people with ADHD. So my question is, what is the impact of differing pathways for neurodevelopment assessment across Scotland, and what steps could be taken to address any differences in assessment pathways by area, if you've got any knowledge of that? Do you want to come in, Danny, if you're nodding?
We see variation in more than assessment pathways, but if the variations are inconsistency, confusion and inequity, it's not just that there's variation. The information each area are talking about assessment pathways and support's different, and it's unclear, and it's also lacking the transparency for the children and for the parents and carers. Parents rely a lot on peer support. That's how Stand started. But we run WhatsApp peer support groups with over 700 members. These are divided by age, not geography. But it makes it very different for even they people to give each other that peer support when they're in 2 different areas and the rules are completely different. So even with these groups, the families can't support each other. And our volunteers have tried to bridge this gap. We've been to several different cities doing empowerment workshops. But it's difficult for even us to give correct advice when we could give a family in East Lothian advice and it's different from a family in the Highlands. And we're still, when we do try and learn these assessment pathways and how it works, quite often the goalposts move and we don't even know they've moved, and professionals don't know they've moved. So it makes it very difficult for all people, you know, parents and carers, the children, but also the public service to understand.
Okay, thank you. Rob?
Yes, I'd agree completely with that. There is a lack of consistency and transparency out there across the country, and different areas apply different processes in order to try and manage the demand, and that means that there are different thresholds. It's obvious. It's not very clear often what those thresholds are, as Danny says. Having a co-occurring learning disability or severe mental health need is one that we hear about a lot. Age is a threshold or a metric that's applied again, so we will find areas that either don't have an adult pathway or it's very difficult to get onto that pathway in the first place. So that's the reality right now. We believe that proposals within the Learning Disability, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill that's being worked on by the Scottish Government will help in this regard, in that there's a proposal around local and national strategies to understand the population and how best to support that population, which we think will go some way to bringing consistency.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to add? Yes, of course, Mark.
Yeah, a couple of things, and Rob is right mentioning the Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill. Of course, the one thing that bill did not have contained within its provisions was a section around assessment and diagnosis. It was the one aspect that was absent that we felt would have merited inclusion within the bill. And we were told at the time that that was because there was separate work being undertaken following the work that was done by the National Autism Implementation Team around neurodevelopmental pathways that would essentially supersede the bill. But at the moment, we don't really know where that work currently sits, what's being done to roll out that broadening of the pathways. I also think that self-referral has a role to play here, and within our evidence, we cited Aberdeen City Council, Aberdeen City, who gave evidence at a recent cross-party group, spoke at a recent cross-party group meeting on autism, and spoke of the fact that they allow self-referral into their pathway, and they're seeing diagnosis rates of 87%. I think in the evidence that Nate have provided, they've spoken about 86% in terms of people receiving a diagnosis, which I think suggests that when people seek a diagnosis, it's because they know that they require one. There's not that frivolity that sometimes is contained within the negative narratives that exist around diagnosis. So I think having a pathway that people can refer into without having to go through a gatekeeping process, which often results in them coming up against lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, or outdated understanding. For example, a lot of traits that people would look for in an assessment may be based on outdated thinking. We've heard testimony from people who have said they were told they weren't getting a referral for an assessment because they were able to maintain eye contact. These are extremely outdated thinkings, but they exist out there and they're resulting in people having doors closed.
Okay. Thank you, Bill.
Just to add to that, the patient pathway doesn't begin when you go on a waiting list. It begins when you first recognise there's a problem. So when someone goes to the GP and says, I think there's something wrong with my child or something contributing to their difficulties, and they're told, no, I don't think you've got autism, that becomes a null diagnosis. It's a hard diagnosis. And very often it means that parents won't revisit the possibility for a number of years, by which time symptoms deteriorate. So I think one of the reasons why we get these huge variations across the country is in terms of professional expertise. And there needs to be, I suppose, an upskilling, particularly at primary healthcare level, but also higher up, of what does constitute the criteria for a diagnosis, or at least for an assessment for a diagnosis. So we're bombarded at the moment with a lot of adults who are saying that they have been refused assessment because they've got a degree. They went to university and have a degree, and that means you can't have ADHD. And it's this like the eye contact. Or you can't have a sense of humour if you have autism. It's these things which mean it becomes much more challenging for people to get the support they need.
Thank you very much. I mean, many of the witnesses answered the second and third question I have, but I'll say them in case there's anything you want to add. So it was about thresholds. My second question was, are there thresholds, which witnesses have clearly said some of them. If there's any other examples you want to give, please do so. And the other thing was about witnesses' view on self-referral for assessment, which again I think you have addressed quite clearly. So is there anything on... Yeah, Mark.
Just one thing to add, perhaps, which is that in those instances where people find that the door is closed on them as a result of an element of gatekeeping in the process or a lack of opportunity for self-referral, the only two paths left then are cope or seek a private diagnosis. And we had evidence to the report that we put together based on our survey that people were spending thousands of pounds on private diagnosis. And the issue that arises there is that in the wider sphere, there is an element of the Wild West around some of the private diagnosis that exists out there. There is a lack of provenance sometimes, and also there is a lack of knowledge of whether or not a private diagnosis will then be accepted. Mm-hmm. So you run the risk of, firstly, if you can afford it, you can seek a private diagnosis. Some people can't. and some people have put themselves in debt in order to achieve it. But they then present that private diagnosis, whether it is to the health service, whether it's to an education provider, whether it's to an employer, to find that that diagnosis is then rejected or not recognised because it has been obtained privately and potentially from a provider that doesn't meet a certain criteria that they were not aware of when they went to seek that private diagnosis.
Yeah, I really appreciate your point, and I think some of my colleagues will ask a little bit more about that as we go through the evidence. Thank you very much. Oh, do you want to come in?
And that's the issue of when you're looking at the criteria, that quality of life ought to be a major consideration, rather than the hard criteria that are set down at the moment in terms of severity and complexity. The question, particularly with a condition like ADHD, which is treatable, is could treatment improve this person's quality of life? And that becomes, I think, an important question to ask.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Joe Fitzpatrick.
Thanks very much. Thanks, colleagues. Keen to ask some questions around waiting times. We've obviously had some evidence and some people talking about their experiences, but I wonder if the panel could just give us their thoughts on the impact of waiting for a diagnosis, either on individuals and on their families, and maybe say a little bit about whether there is good practice, particularly in areas about, there is a waiting time, there are these things that can be done during that period of time, and, other areas that do that well in spite of having waiting times.
So you've raised a very good point about when you're on a wait list, what happens, which is one of the points I was going to raise today, because over a period of time, if we think about a young person aged 11 and they're on a wait list of 4 or 5 years, you think about all the changes that that young person is going through anyway in terms of puberty and their environmental changes and the demands that are being placed upon them and the environmental risks that occur during that time. That if a young person does display some of the characteristics of inattentiveness and hyperactivity and impulsivity in particular, that's very often the time that things go wrong, and they disengage from family and they disengage from school. That is the pathway to substance use, that is the pathway to prison. And so not getting the support in early can have a profound impact on the trajectories of this population. So I think it is very, very important that where there is a need for assessment and presumably treatment or possibly treatment, that is done timeously.
Thank you.
Just build a bit on that. I mean, it's a common issue that comes to us from families who are waiting months or even years for a diagnosis for their child, and the negative impacts that can occur from that. Ultimately, if you don't have that diagnosis, you won't necessarily know where to turn to for support, what strategies are helpful, what strategies are potentially harmful. There is an awful lot of evidence that shows that a child diagnosed will not require, when they become an adult, will not require mental health support later down the line. So, but the reality is a lot of people then that don't have that diagnosis, that are waiting, are struggling on and trying to manage their mental health perhaps to the best of their ability, but in some cases that can reach a crisis point, impacting on education, employment opportunities, and so on, and particularly for children and young people, when we're talking about if you're waiting 18 months, 2 years for a diagnosis during those formative years while you're in school, and the diagnosis is that gateway to support, then it can be hugely detrimental. And then, of course, there is, as Mark has talked about, there is the issue around those that are waiting and feel that they can't wait, and they have the financial resources to pay for a private diagnosis, and all of the challenges that brings as well.
Danny?
We hear from our families that the longer that they're waiting for the assessment, the longer it is before their child's needs are fully met and properly understood. Children are losing years of development, families are being left in limbo, and support is being delayed or withheld. I want to just say that a parent spoke to me last week and said that she described the waiting period as physically and emotionally torturous. And another family says that even though her daughter is self-harming, and they were put on a waiting list, they were then taken off the waiting list, and they're now having to gather more evidence. And so we're putting children through that trauma of a second waiting list, which is really difficult when these children are being so vulnerable and open up to people, especially when it is people like education, because parents can't self-refer.
Mark?
Yeah, I suppose you asked about good practice, and I suppose I would, I think that's fair, because we want to not just highlight where things are going poorly, but also where are things working, and is that something that could be shared? And I think, based on our experiences, I think there's a lot of pockets of good practice that exist out there, but it's not systemic, it's not universal. So I don't think we could point to any one particular health board or local authority area and say these people are getting it right. I think in some places, if you've got a professional who has a level of understanding, or you've got a team that are working in a neuroaffirmative way, we had a lot of very positive response to our survey that we did around the experience that people had, for example, with the number 6 service in Lothian, and you'll be hearing from number 6 in your next panel. And that was because you were looking at a group that were neurodivergent in terms of the team who were working to support individuals through the process, and it was a neuro-inclusive, neuroaffirmative process that people felt very, very welcome and trusted within. I think that there are good examples out there that we've heard about people being provided with information during their wait, and I think that the difficulty that a lot of people face is that limbo. They are put onto a waiting list, but they're not necessarily told what to expect in terms of what the length of time will be, what will happen during that process, what will happen, where the end point of that process will be. We've heard of people being given information by statutory services that is meant to provide community support opportunities, often with outdated information on it, so there's not that they're not keeping up to date with what is actually out there within the community, so people immediately start to lose trust in the process at that point. So I think there's more connectivity required to understand what is out there that can support people while they're on that journey, but also how to give people realistic advice around what that journey is going to look like. And I think the last thing I would say, and this I suppose will be particularly relevant to yourself, Joe, is if we look at Tayside as an example where a decision was made around removing children from the waiting list unless they had a co-occurring mental health condition, that caused a great deal of anxiety and uncertainty for people. And I don't think that there was enough explanation given for what that meant for people who were expecting to get a diagnosis, and what it means for people who are worried that their child may age out of children's services before achieving a diagnosis. Does it then mean that they face an even longer wait for an adult diagnosis? And if they're in an area that doesn't do adult diagnosis, what then?
Thanks for that, Mark. And I think your point about communication and keeping people aware of what the pathway is and what they can expect is something that, I guess, right across the country could be taken on pretty quickly and pretty easily. But your example of NHS Tayside shows exactly the opposite and how you can get it so wrong. So thanks for flagging that up, because I think everyone can learn from that experience. NHS Tayside, I believe, has done, and certainly hope has done. So obviously, it's useful to hear folks' thoughts on the impact of waiting times. Is there anybody got any thoughts on how we can get those times down so that people get a diagnosis without such long? Is there something that we can do across the system that will make a difference to reduce those waiting times?
And I speak from personal experience, and that is in 2010, Tayside recognised that there was a real problem with autism assessment. So the wait time was about 4.5 years. They held a Kaizen Blitz, and as a result of that, developed a multi-agency pathway for assessment. And I, as an educator, was invited onto that, and I was trained in certain aspects of assessment. There was social work, there were educational psychologists, there was psychology, there was psychiatry. But the bulk of the work in that pathway was done by allied health professionals, and in particular trained speech and language therapists who did the bulk of the legwork around assessment. And we brought wait times down from 4.5 years to 6 months over a period of about 2 years. It took probably about 2 years to work through it. So it's doable. And it does mean breaking down some professional silos. I think it does mean training up allied health professionals who are a wonderful resource, and I don't think they get the respect perhaps that they are due. And also perhaps developing a new category of clinical professional called a clinical interviewer, someone who does the information gathering and takes that away from these very high-paid and very able consultant psychiatrists and psychologists. And that should speed up the process immediately. But also there are tools like the Development and Wellbeing Assessment used by the NHS in England, which is a broad-ranging assessment tool that I've worked with and found to be extremely accurate, extremely effective. And we, in a pilot project, managed to turn around assessment in 10 working days. So, okay. And that didn't give a concrete diagnosis, but it did give a profile that was very useful to parents.
Okay, thanks very much. Anybody else got any? Mark?
I absolutely echo what Bill's saying. And if you look at the work that Nate did around adult neurodevelopmental pathways, which was about that broadening of the team that can support and provide a diagnosis, I think, we talked earlier about, the numbers of people seeking a diagnosis are increasing, but the door through which those people can access that diagnosis has not been widened. So if you widen that door, create a broader team that can support a diagnosis, then by definition you will bring those numbers down. And I think that's the key in all of this, is moving to a different model to support that. I think the challenge that we see is that in some places there's this idea that if you close down that model, then it sort of makes the issue go away. We've seen, Aberdeenshire, for example, they've put up a saving of £200,000 to close their adult autism and ADHD assessment. But that need doesn't disappear, it just gets displaced and potentially ends up being funneled into crisis support services. So often when we talk about these things, people say, but there's a cost attached. There's a cost attached at either end of this, and the question is whether the financial cost outweighs the human cost, which also comes with a financial cost.
Build a bit on that and echo what Bill and Mark have said. The current system is not set up for the current level of demand, and that there's a gap there between the workforce capacity and the demand for assessment. So we think that there is an urgent need for funding at the moment in order to develop and train that workforce, but also then it does need to be longer-term funding as well, because at the moment the system is in crisis mode, so there isn't the resources there to develop, to plan effectively and develop innovative ways of identification, research, testing, and so on. And just to echo Bill's point as well, there is good practice would be in terms of the assessment also to have a case coordinator that is keeping the person up to date with the process, gathering the right information, being a single point of contact, and that's not always the case. As well. And then just coming back to your previous question about support for those waiting as well, because diagnosis is just one element here. There is also the Autistic Adult Support Fund, which the Scottish Government has set up, which provides pre- and post-diagnostic support for autistic adults, and there's a lot of good practice being developed there, and I should say we're a recipient of that funding as well. So there's an awful lot of good practice there that we know works in terms of supporting people that might face a lengthy wait.
Thank you. Tanya, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to the question about addressing the long waits for diagnosis. We've worked on some points here that could be done now and wouldn't take a lot of effort, or the fair allocation of staff would be a start. the same multidisciplinary teams that are assessing the kids in CAMHS can assess the autistic and ADHD children, as well as those with the co-occurring mental health conditions. So just allocate them fairly. Start the support, just echoing that as well, start the support from the first concern and continue it during the assessment and carry on after diagnosis. And this will mean the children that are on the waiting list are supported throughout the whole process. But transparency, routinely publish the ND waiting time so families aren't hidden from the system, and be consistent across Scotland. So one national framework and children aren't penalised for living in a different postcode or even just having a different professional involved in their care.
Okay, thank you very much.
Elena Whitwell.
Good morning to everybody, and thank you so very much for coming along. This is one of those times in life where your lived experience for me is actually converging with my role here as an MSP to actually get evidence from yourselves. I want to spend a wee bit of time focusing on the availability of support. You have all touched on that already, but I want to think about the fact that that diagnosis seems to be contingent a lot of the time on, accessing support. Is that something that you have experienced as, from your organisations? And could you give examples of perhaps where a diagnosis is required? I understand in terms of medication for ADHD, absolutely. But in all the other, availability of support, we seem to have this diagnosis being the blocker that's put in front of people. I don't know who wants to start with that.
That one. We all know, in theory, the absence of a diagnosis shouldn't exclude children from support. But in practice, it does. It becomes a gatekeeper because local authorities apply criteria to access things like risk and traffic blue badges, disability social work help, which in East Lothian also requires an additional diagnosis on top of that in order to qualify. But many families we support have, for example, issues with sleep, and they're not allowed to try things like melatonin without a diagnosis. And housing, East Lothian's housing policy states that you've got to, and I quote, to have tried to treat autism, which is a dangerous narrative in itself. It reads like autism is an illness that can be treated, and it's factually wrong. But my view is, if this is their approach, it's extremely unlikely that they would apply the housing points without a diagnosis, if their view is to treat the autism, which is obviously factually wrong. Autistic and ADHD children do have rights under the Equality Act, but to enforce the rights, they need to show that their child is disabled, and without a diagnostic assessment, the evidence that's gathered is that if the assessment is the evidence most of the time. So we need to put them into that diagnostic assessment to get them protected under the Equality Act. And for families, this isn't about chasing a piece of paper. It's about their children need to be seen, they need to be believed, and they need to be given a chance to thrive. When diagnosis is treated as an optional extra, children we see, they tell us they're left feeling invisible. And they just want to, coming back to the question, that they need this diagnosis to be believed. To, even in society, day to day, going to the supermarket and having a meltdown, it's for a parent to be able to say, my child is autistic, it means they can't be chucked out of soft play or supermarket, but they can't say that without knowing themselves through a diagnostic assessment. And I'll stop now because I could talk about this all day.
Thank you. I think we could listen to you talk about it all day, but obviously for time we can't. Rob, do you have anything to add to that at all?
Well, I think Danny's articulated it really, really clearly, and the system shouldn't be reliant on a diagnosis for support. We've got getting it right for every child, for example. We've got the Equality Act. But I think the world we're operating is a world in which resources are really, really tight. And so a diagnosis does become more important in that scenario. And, we hear from parents that have said, they need a diagnosis for their child in order for the school to resource speech and language therapy, for example. As well as within the social care setting, for example, a diagnosis can be important. And then going back to that point that Danny made around being believed, and the reality that there are these kind of narratives out there, these poisonous narratives about overdiagnosis, and so having that diagnosis can be very important in an employment context as well. Even though you shouldn't need that, the Equality Act should mean that you have reasonable adjustments. Nevertheless, it can be helpful in that context, and with health professionals as well, which might not be an expert on autism, but nevertheless have quite a strong opinion on that. And so, in those contexts, a diagnosis can be very important as well.
Thank you. And Bill, from the perspective of ADHD?
It's a given that you can't get treatment without a diagnosis. But there are a number of other areas, one of which is that for the young person or the adult themselves, having the diagnosis gives them a clear steer on where to seek support and the type of support to seek, because many will have been medicated for anxiety or depression for a number of years. Maybe borderline personality disorder has been given a diagnosis, or emotionally unstable personality disorder. And if they get the diagnosis of ADHD, then they can, with greater clarity, seek whatever support is out there in the community. So I think that's important as well.
Think specifically about children who potentially have ADHD in the classroom setting. Rob, you just spoke about needing sometimes a diagnosis to actually be able to offer the support in the classroom. If we think about things like movement breaks and the ability to use fidget toys and different things like that, do you think that that type of provision and support should be available regardless of diagnosis for young people?
Having spent my working life in education, it saddens me that children spend so much time in buildings and not outside, that they're not active, that they're not challenged in outdoor settings with an outdoor curriculum. I worry about the length of some lessons. They may be too long, for example. I think there's a lot, open plan classrooms, there's a lot that there are a lot of obstacles, there are a lot of challenges in the way within the education system, and of course I could speak all day about that. But I think looking from an ADHD perspective, those adjustments wouldn't just benefit children with ADHD; they would benefit the school population. Having said that, there are also challenges when you may be trying to address the educational needs of children with autism, who may require a different type of environment and delivery of the curriculum. So less stimulation, a bit more structure. And so we've got to be realistic. We're competing with, it's a very complex picture. And we can't change a system overnight, but it often depends on individual teachers within the system who perhaps have lived experience, who then translate their own lived experience into making the differences for young people within a school.
Thank you. And some of the evidence that we took in a written format, there was an assertion from the Edinburgh CAMHS team that support provision must be fundamentally reimagined to prioritise individual needs over diagnostic labels. To what extent do you agree with that assertion? I'll start with Mark, if that's all right.
Yeah, I suppose I can deal with your previous question and this in a sort of combined fashion. In a perfect world, absolutely, support would follow need, and there wouldn't be that need for a diagnostic label. But as has been highlighted, this is not a perfect world, and there is finite resource out there. But we've spoken already about things like incorrect diagnosis, misdiagnosis. You know, the idea that without that assessment and diagnosis, you can absolutely ensure that the support matches the profile of need. It may do in some cases, but also it's about giving the individual that empowerment. We spoke earlier about what does a diagnosis mean for an individual, and it's that empowerment, that ability to advocate, that feeling that they can talk about the needs that they have and how those needs can be supported. Without that diagnosis, that conversation becomes potentially more difficult in some contexts, may lead to refusal to provide support, and that can create a negative spiral. So I think what sits at the centre of all of this is that the ability to access an assessment which can lead to a diagnosis helps to unlock support. In some places, that support will potentially flow anyway. Certainly from our own perspective, people who contact our advice line or access our community services, they can do that at any stage on their diagnostic journey. So they don't need to have achieved a diagnosis in order to access those support services. And that's an approach that is broadly taken across the third sector. But often that's because there isn't that support available for those individuals already from statutory services. So the third sector is essentially filling a need that exists that the statutory services are not dealing with.
So that's really helpful to hear. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that?
Yes. Diagnosis and needs-led support, it shouldn't be an either-or, providing early interventions and meeting needs should be complementary to a diagnosis, not instead of it. They're both valuable, and diagnosis is a need in and of itself. I don't necessarily agree with the assertion of that statement. I think it's important to say that needs-led support is context-specific. So, for example, it supports someone at a specific point in time, in school, for example, and obviously people have a variety of experiences and experience different transition points and major events throughout their life, and their needs will often change. So having that diagnosis helps that person navigate through those transitions and build the strategies to help them in those situations. So we shouldn't be delaying diagnosis until somebody's situation is acute or they're in crisis in any way, because that is no good for the individual, no good for the system. Of course, I think we are a little bit concerned about sometimes the debate in this space is focused on is more about reducing referrals rather than making sure we're actually tackling the issue here, which is not a problem of demand, it's a problem of supply in terms of ensuring we've got the right number of assessments and we've got the right level of support.
Thank you very much. I've got one final question, and that's around about what wider benefits could result from the appropriate supports being made available at the right time. Now, what difference could that make for people if those appropriate supports started as early as possible at the right time for them?
Dan, if you like. I mean, it shouldn't be necessary to provide the wider benefits in order to justify a timely assessment and support, but it's important to remember autistic and ADHD children have the right to healthcare just like all other children, but it's true when support comes at the right time, the benefits far extend beyond the child. It creates stronger families, calmer classrooms and reduced pressure on services because problems are prevented rather than left to escalate. Children and their families believe they should be believed, they should be supported and they should be given the opportunity for diagnostic assessment where a child meets the criteria for that. The right time for support and assessment for us should be as soon as the first concern is raised, whether that is by the child themselves, a family member, a teacher, a professional. You know, harm is caused not only to the child but to their family and to wider society. The clearest wider benefit of acting at the right time is simply the prevention of unnecessary harm. A parent recently told us that the impact on their mental health and their other children and even their relationships have been huge, all because they didn't get what they needed at the right time. Other wider benefits would include things like better education for the child and other children, healthier communities and more efficient and responsible use of public resources and finance. Ultimately, if every child is supported, nurtured and given the opportunity to thrive, then society could get the benefit of what these children have to offer. Instead of our children being seen as, for example, distractible, stubborn and impulsive, they could be seen for who we believe they truly are, which is curious, determined and creative. What is so heartbreaking for us at Stand is that many of the parents and carers that we see are in crisis mode. They're living hour to hour and day to day and have little capacity to think about the wider benefits of their child getting what they need. Parents and carers have told us that our children are barely surviving, let alone thriving, and one parent told me this weekend that they can't go on. I attend our in-person events every week and I hear these things firsthand, and I witness parents and carers in tears pretty much every time I go. And the truth is, the wider benefits are obvious: better education, healthier families and stronger communities, but parents tell us they can't even think about that right now because they're just trying to survive today. And if we act at the right time, children could thrive and society would gain so much, but at first we have to stop the harm.
Thank you very much. Very powerful thing for us to hear this morning. Bill, from an ADHD perspective, you already touched on some of the issues that can develop in a person's life in the absence of diagnosis and support. Could you speak a little bit more to that?
Again, a recent study published in Sweden where they looked at treated versus untreated ADHD. And that gives a very good picture. So you're not comparing treatment against a normal population. You're taking the ADHD population and looking at outcomes for those who are treated and those who are not treated. And that study found that treatment led to a 15% reduction in suicide attempts, a 25% reduction in substance use, 4% for accidental injuries, 16% for transport accidents, and 25% for criminality. And I translate that into the costs of those to society of traffic accidents, of suicide attempts, of everything else, and think that treatment saves money. Treatment is going to save money in other parts of the system, but then you also look at the care system and the number of very complex individuals who are in the care system. And I say complex because often it's not simply ADHD, there are other things as well that have happened. But if we can keep families together, but by providing the treatment when it is needed and the understanding when it's needed, that is a huge saving to society of children entering the care system. Because we, as the state, are not a very good parent generally, and it's much better if families are kept together, and that's government and national policy, I think.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. And Sanders Gahani's got a quick supplementary. I can't hear you, Sandesh.
Thank you. Sorry, it's just waiting for the to be unmuted. Thank you. A question of interest as a practicing NHS GP. Danny, I just want to come back to something that you were talking about when it comes to disruption in schools. Now, a big concern that I have is with the presumption of mainstreaming. There is a lack of support teachers available for people with ADHD, with other diagnoses, who are deaf, who have additional support needs. So even with a diagnosis, do we see a big difference when it comes to schooling?
That's a really good question, and I can answer this personally because I have one child who's diagnosed and one child who's on a waiting list. And yes, it's very different, but not that there's more funding for that child magically overnight, but that I, as the parent, have the confidence to know that I'm right and know that I am not going to be told that the child does not have these needs, because I have the diagnostic assessment to prove that he needs this, and it gives me the opportunity to not only, fight for the right with the school, but if I don't feel that with them, I can then take it to local authority, and they have to, meet my child's educational rights.
Convener, if I can.
Mark?
Yeah. If I could just add to that, and I'm aware that we're potentially straying into the Education Committee, but I think there's an important reason for that. And I think when we think about the learning disabilities, autism and neurodivergence bill, one of the things which I think we were really keen about, and one of the reasons why we were so supportive of that legislation and why we're so disappointed that it's not going to be passed in this session of Parliament, is it's about looking at that whole life journey, that whole life experience. So this committee is rightly focusing on assessment and diagnosis, but once the individual has achieved that diagnosis, that is not the end of their story. There are whole other areas of their life that they then have to go into and access support or identify support or advocate in order to try and get support to be made available. And on the point about education, I think it comes back to the point that Elena Witham was making about, you know, what exists out there or what doesn't exist out there, what difference could the right support make? And a really good example, I think, is around the use of informal exclusions in education. So 6 years ago, ourselves, National Autistic Society and Children in Scotland, produced a report where we spoke about informal exclusions in school, which is when the parent gets a phone call, maybe 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, can you come and pick up your son or daughter? They're not coping at school. They then have to take them home, and that happens on an almost daily basis, which means at least one parent is locked out of the workforce because they have to be available for the child coming home from school. The child is not accessing and benefiting from education. So nobody is benefiting in that scenario. The education authority is not benefiting, the child's not benefiting, the parent's not benefiting. But that practice persists. We highlighted it 6 years ago. Our advice line continues to receive calls in this area. So Elena Witham talks about the right support being available. Sandesh Gulhani rightly identifies support within the education system. That's one element where, if we got that right, it would potentially unlock benefits, both economic, both in health, both education, in all different areas. But if we only look at things through one particular prism, we don't see the whole picture.
Thank you. Patrick Harvey.
Thank you very much, and good morning to the witnesses. I'd say I'm already learning a lot, so thank you very much for the evidence that you've been giving. The issue of private diagnosis has come up a couple of times in the conversation already, and I wanted to ask some specific questions about that. We've heard about the reasons why diagnosis is so important. We've heard about the reasons why, well, we've heard about the facts that private diagnosis may be quicker and easier to achieve if someone's got the money. I'm not quite clear whether that's entirely because of capacity in the private sector or different practices in the private sector as to why it's quicker. We've heard about the unfairness, about the amount of money that it costs. Mark MacDonald mentioned people moving into debt in significant circumstances because of that. And I think you also, Mark, used the phrase Wild West in terms of the variation in standards. About what private diagnosis actually consists of and whether it's recognised in other services. And in the written evidence, we also see a big variation in what it costs, in the actual prices involved. And again, I'm not clear what the reasons for that is. So can I ask you either a comment about the current situation or, ideally, what you think the role of private diagnosis should be? And whoever would like to kick off.
This is something that comes up a lot for us in relation to shared care, where a private diagnosis is given and then the treatment is refused by the GP. The patient has to go private, and that costs between £150 and £300 a month for a treatable condition. So that comes up an awful lot. The issue of what is the landscape of private assessment in Scotland for ADHD, and it's very varied, and you've got some very good providers, and you've probably got some who are not so good, and the quality of assessment can be very variable. And the fact that we don't know what the landscape is in itself quite interesting, because we ought to know. What I do know is that some of the private providers are people who previously worked within the NHS and decided to get out and set up their own practices, primarily because they wanted to deliver a service that they didn't feel they could within the NHS. So they're not all driven by profit and greed. We often think of private equals bad, and I'm very cautious about that. In terms of the coalition, we take a neutral stance on this. In the past, we tended to persuade people to go down the NHS route. I think things have got so difficult at the moment that we don't perpetuate that message anymore. I think there needs to be a degree of flexibility. Private providers tend to be quicker. They tend to have a much more personalised approach in terms of getting to know the patient, and they tend to take a more long-term view that once you've got the diagnosis, then there ought to be some form of aftercare. But it's very difficult to generalise because the standards are so variable across the country.
Okay. Anyone else?
I think just to build on that, in terms of autism, a common question we're asked is, can you recommend a private diagnostician? And of course, it's something we don't do. We say to people, do your research, do your homework, look at the clinicians that are providing that service, the diagnostic tools that they're using. Are they membership of the right professional bodies, plugged into appropriate professional? Essentially, we're asking people to quality assure those private providers, because there isn't a quality assurance framework there, so we can't be confident in the quality. And as Bill says, there are some very good reputable providers, former NHS clinicians, using up-to-date tools, etc. And then there are others which we hear that's not the case. So I think it is an issue, and it is an issue in terms of the context of long waiting lists and people increasingly seeking that out. And it feels like that is a marketplace that is developing quite rapidly with demand. So I think it's an important part of the conversation, and I think if we are to allow that marketplace to expand, then we do need to have quite serious conversations about how do we quality assure that, because the reality is that we know that there are people that will go and get a private diagnosis, and then NHS doesn't recognise that because they can't, for exactly the same reason, they can't assure the quality there.
Can I just ask you to say a little more about that variation within private provision? You've talked about quality. There's also the price variation. Do you know how that compares with the cost to the NHS of NHS diagnosis? Is, acknowledging that somebody else is paying for it, the taxpayer is paying in one case and the individual is paying in the other, but does the actual cost of providing the service compare between the private sector and the NHS?
That's a good question, and perhaps other panellists might have better insight than I do. I mean, when it comes to a good quality assessment within the NHS, the cost can vary depending on the context, whether it's a child or an adult, and then assessments themselves should be multidisciplinary with different clinicians involved. So for a child, paediatrician, educational psychologist, speech and language therapist, but depending on the complexity of that individual, it might involve other professionals as well, social work, nursing, health professionals. So I can't quite answer the question, because I think the cost of the NHS will be quite variable depending on the individual, but perhaps other panellists, I don't know, might have a bit more insight than I do.
I think there's an interesting discussion to be had within the clinical world about the degree to which some of the gold standard assessment pathways are absolutely necessary, particularly in a time of crisis. Whether so for example, I do the ADIR, which is a diagnostic interview. It takes about 3.5 hours to do. It takes about three hours to write up a report. That's a day's work for one patient. Is it absolutely necessary to do all of that work, or should we be trusting clinicians to use clinical judgment and thus? And I say without compromising clinical integrity, without compromising the diagnosis and the diagnostic process, do we really need to jump through all of these hurdles? So that I think there's a sort of workforce exercise to be done about is can we expedite this in some way? Can we make these patient pathways a lot slicker than they currently are? And that's a question for the clinicians themselves.
Thank you. Any of the other witnesses want to talk about this general theme of private provision, any of the aspects?
A couple of points. So I think, when Rob talks about the lack of quality assurance, that's where the sort of the Wild West comment came from, is that we don't really know what the quality and provenance of a lot of providers are. There are a lot of very good providers out there, but the difficulty that we face, similar to NES Scotland, is we get people phoning us up to our advice line, one, thinking that we can give them a diagnosis, and two, asking us, where can I go to get a diagnosis? And we don't feel that we can make those recommendations in order to direct people, because people may not may not receive a diagnosis. You know, it's one thing to get an assessment, it's another thing to get a diagnosis at the end of that assessment. But also, you know, we can't say with absolute guarantee that if they go to a private provider and they get assessed and diagnosed, that that will then be accepted by their employer, by the school, by the health board. But the key to this is what is driving people to seek private assessment? You know, what sits at the root of this? And the root of it is people are waiting significant lengths of time on NHS lists, and they are seeking an alternative route. And if we deal with that root cause, then you will see the number of people who are seeking private diagnosis reduce as a result of that. You're right in terms of cost variation. I'm not entirely sure what drives that. But we've seen, you know, from the survey that we did in 2023, I think the highest cost that was reported to us was £4,500. I suspect that this has not been cushioned from inflation, so I suspect it will be even higher now in terms of that upper limit. And some people can afford that. But what you then get into a situation of is that those who can afford a diagnosis can seek one, those who cannot have to wait and potentially not achieve one. And I think that creates a wider inequity in terms of the demographics that we're dealing with here, because I think you'll see demographically there are trends that, as a result, people are being excluded from that opportunity to achieve a diagnosis.
I think Danny hasn't spoken yet. Do you want to come in?
Most of my points were covered, but I will say from what we hear from families is they're not going for a private assessment because they want to. They're going because they don't feel like they have another option. And we've had it described as it feels like they're paying for paying for it twice, once with money, and then a second time with their child's well-being because they're having to re-go another assessment. We think that if the same clinicians that are following same standards can diagnose on the NHS, why wouldn't that judgment be respected somewhere else, especially when you're not giving families a reasonable other option?
Sorry, can I just check? Do you mean that some of the private providers are doing NHS work and private work?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. The follow-up questions I had were, I think, mostly addressed in terms of the variation in standards, and I think there were also some comments about shared care agreements and the desire for some clarity and consistency around that. So the last question that I've got really on this is if, and it's a big if there is a need to use external capacity outside the NHS in order to bridge the gap between the capacity and the demand that's there at the moment. Is there a case for saying that that capacity should be located in the third sector and that there should be an agreement between NHS providers and voluntary organisations that operate on a not-for-profit basis, that could operate to an agreed standard for an agreed price, and that's the better way of increasing? I mean, it's private in the sense that it's not NHS, but it's not on a paid-for basis by individuals. Is that potentially a more affordable and potentially even a more inclusive way of increasing the capacity across the sector to meet demand?
I spoke earlier. I suppose we should declare interest as members of the third sector, shouldn't we? But I spoke earlier about number 6, which is not a Scottish Autism initiative. It's Autism Initiatives in Lothian, which received very positive feedback. So, you know, these things are possible. I think the difficulty is, and I think, you know, we would all speak from the third sector about this, is that often the third sector finds itself chasing pots of money for innovation, which is designed to provide support to statutory services, but that doesn't have a lasting effect. So you build something up, you deliver it, you show that it works, but the funding is not continuous, and therefore you then have to scale it back down or close it altogether. And you know, we saw that during the course of the 10-year autism strategy, which sometimes felt a bit like 10 one-year autism strategies, because lots of money was put out there for different pilot projects, but how much of that was actually embedded? You know, I've analogised it to a snowbound airport. Lots of pilots, but nothing took off. And that's the problem, is if we're going to put money into things, we have to use the learning that we get from that to embed that into the systems that are out there. And I don't think the evidence is there to show that that's happened previously. So I think, yes, potentially, if you build on some of the evidence of good examples that exist out there. But I think there's also a wariness that we've seen this happen before and we've not seen it lead to systemic change across Scotland.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Patrick. I'm very conscious of time, but I'm going to extend it. So, Brian Whittle could ask his questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you very much to the panel for coming in. I'm like Patrick, I'm learning an awful lot. I'm really taken by what you said, Mark, around not just the fact that we have everybody has the right to health and the right to treatment, to improve that quality of life, but also by doing so, how that impacts, that resource to benefit, how that impacts education, how that impacts our economy, how it impacts workplace welfare, justice, and how we seem to look in, in these silos rather look at the benefits across that. So a couple of things I wanted to talk about. One is funding and workforce. And can I ask what the witnesses consider are the key funding and resource challenges related to neurodevelopmental assessment in the first place? Can I just start with that question? I don't know who wants to go in that.
When the NHS closed the wait list for children with a straight ADHD profile, one of the reasons given was that they couldn't man the workforce, that they weren't able to find the clinicians to address the capacity that was coming through. And it struck me that that was an admission of poor workforce planning, that over a period of time, it's been very obvious what's happening in terms of ADHD assessment, that you're going to get far more adults coming through looking for an assessment, and adult women in particular, because that trend was picked up in America about 15, 20 years ago. And we tend to get America's weather, don't we, when it comes across. So if it was known and if it was anticipated, why wasn't it planned for? And I think there's an issue about workforce morale. I think that it's a bit of a Cinderella, CALMS is a bit of a Cinderella service. They don't really, and it's very complex. We've got to take into account that as well as the sort of routine process of diagnosis and assessment, they're dealing with some very, very complex mental health issues of self-harm and suicide and so on. I don't think they look after the workforce. I'm very pro-clinician. A lot of the issues we're facing have not been caused by clinicians themselves, but by clinical managers. And so I think there is an issue about assessing and consulting with that workforce. So, well, what do you think? How do you think we could speed things up and improve things? And how could we be more innovative? So, yeah, I think there's a good question to ask about that.
Okay. Does anybody else want to, Mark?
I think it comes down to a question of prioritisation, and I think that a lot of autistic people feel like their needs are not a priority for statutory services, and I think when you see pathways being closed, that feeds that narrative. And I think this inquiry is welcome, but I think if any other service that is provided by our National Health Service was to turn around tomorrow and say, we're going to stop providing assessment and diagnosis for children or for adults, there would, it would never be off the news. It would be raised at First Minister's questions on a weekly basis. And I think that while this has been raised, it hasn't felt like it has been something that everybody is rallying around and saying, this needs to be addressed. This cannot be the situation that we are content with. So I think that lack of prioritisation, or that feeling of a lack of prioritisation, filters down. And I think what we need to see is more of a statement essentially to the effect that people across Scotland who require an assessment should be entitled to receive one. Effectively a national guarantee, I think, is what we need to see.
in fact, layer on top of that, while we're discussing this, how then do we address those shortages and training gaps? How do we deliver that message, and how do we practically deliver the solutions to that?
Yeah, I mean, you don't address that capacity issue overnight. I get that. But I think when we've spoken about that broadening of the professionals who can be involved in that assessment, that begins the process of bridging that gap, which allows you then to divert resource into training and filling those roles that will be needed in the future to provide a more comprehensive team, a more comprehensive approach to assessment. So in the first instance, it's taking the learning that we got from the neurodevelopmental pathway pilots that were done by NATE, taking that to across Scotland. Best practice is a bad traveller, but there's no reason why we can't take the learning from those pilots and apply it elsewhere. And then in the intervening period, you then do that, as you say, that assessment of what is the need going forward, how do we ensure that this is a sustainable model for the future, and do the work to build that up and bring it up to scale.
Yeah, just build on that and echo what Marcus said, and I think looking to the pilots of the National Autism implementation team, that the work that they did around those pilot areas is important. Absolutely agree with the point about expanding the multidisciplinary team that can be involved in that assessment. At the heart of it, there is a workforce shortage, and so there is a resourcing question, there's a funding question, there's a short-term funding question in terms of the crisis that the system is in now, but then a longer-term commitment is needed in order to, because as Mark says, you can't turn the workforce situation around overnight. It takes time, it takes resourcing. I think the next set of questions is around data gathering, and I think this is important here when you're talking about workforce planning and resourcing, because short of the odd FOI request or the odd press piece, the issues in this area are not well known by the general public a lot of the time. There is a different situation around data collection in England, where data around those seeking a diagnosis, waiting times are routinely collected and published quarterly, and that aids planning as well. So, there's a debate down south about, okay, this is the amount of people on the waiting list, this is the resource that we need to find in order to meet that demand. So we're unable to have that debate just now because those figures aren't out there publicly for discussion.
I mean, you're right. I was going to finish with data. I was saying, presumably, without quality data, consistent quality data, it makes workforce planning more difficult. So, I suppose the last question I would ask is how that access to high quality, up-to-date information on demand for services help to plan and deliver those services. And what can I just ask what we routinely publish just now in Scotland, and how that needs to develop? I don't know who wants to answer that question.
Well, there's no data routinely published at a national level in terms of the number of people seeking a diagnosis, waiting times. In England, that data is routinely collected and published and disaggregated across region, age, gender, etc. So that is the sort of data that you would need in order to make planning more effective, including workforce development. That's not to say that local areas are not collecting data. They are, and there will be FOI requests from time to time from organisations such as ourselves or others seeking that data. So it does come into the public domain. And I noticed that the SPICE briefing that went along with this session had tried to pull together all of the bits of data out there, but it's very difficult to pull that together, and of course not all local areas provide that data centrally, so it then becomes very difficult really to be confident about the national picture and the numbers.
Mark?
I think at the moment, when you have a situation where in some places no pathways exist, it's very difficult for you to collect data, because at the moment nobody's waiting in some places because then there is no waiting list for them to be put onto. And so I think until you can address that universality that needs to apply, it's going to be difficult to build the data to give you a true reflection of what is out there, what is the situation facing people. I think also what data around waiting lists will not give you is the information around, so we spoke about people who are waiting for a long period of time and then choose to go for a private diagnosis. Now, those people effectively come off of a waiting list, but that doesn't mean that they've been seen as part of the NHS system. It just means that they've come off the waiting list because they've gone and sought a private diagnosis, or people have maybe aged out of child services and are now on an adult waiting list. So data is good to have, but there will be stories within that data that I think it will be difficult for you to fully extrapolate from. And also at the moment, because some areas are offering different approaches, it would be difficult to get data on a national picture that will tell you a meaningful story, I think. So one of the things that we've spoken about is that at the moment, for the autistic community, people often ask about why the Learning Disability Autism Neurodivergence Bill was an important bill and why we were so supportive of it. And I think if you look at life outcomes, whether that's in education, whether that's employment, whether that's in health, autistic people have significantly poorer outcomes than the general population. So we are asked in the consultation, there is no current equivalent for the autistic community of the Learning Disabilities Observatory, which exists at Glasgow University, which collects population data for people with learning disabilities. We think there should be some similar approach taken for the autistic community, which would help to better understand, what are the main issues affecting the autistic community and how can those be addressed through public policy.
So many questions to go, Convener, but I know we're running out of time, so I'll leave it there.
Since there are no further questions, can I thank the witnesses for their attendance today and for their evidence, and I will briefly suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover of witnesses. We will continue our previous agenda item by taking oral evidence from a second panel of witnesses as part of the committee's inquiry into ADHD and ASD pathways and support. As I mentioned at the beginning of the previous session, given that some of the witnesses who we'll be hearing from are themselves individuals with ADHD, autism or both, we have sought to make reasonable adjustments to support them in giving evidence to the committee this morning. This has included providing witnesses with the questions we plan to ask in advance of the meeting. If anybody attending today's meeting needs to take a break or at any point, please indicate this to myself or the clerks, and I welcome you to the committee. And Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener.
Emma, sorry, apologies.
Yes.
Okay? I jumped the gun there, okay? Can I welcome to the committee Cam Brooke, Chair of Autism Rights Group Highland, Matthew Day, National One Stop Shop Manager, number 6, Sophie Farzana, Director and Co-Founder of Scottish Ethnic Minority Autism, CIMA, and Lindsay McAdam, Chief Executive Officer, SWAN Scotland. And Emma Harper, could you ask questions?
Thank you. Thanks, Convener. Good morning to you all. Some of you might have been in the room for the initial session. I'm going to just go with the aspects around diagnosis. So I'd be interested to hear from you whether you consider that there are currently diagnostic gaps for neurodevelopmental conditions in Scotland, and do these vary by health board area?
I think, yes, there are significant gaps, and they 100% vary by area. I think that's changed over the last few years as well, for the worse. So there are very few areas, I think, that have a well-functioning pathway at the moment, and the reality in most places ranges from no pathway at all to a pathway that has very high threshold to access an assessment, that you can't get an assessment unless, for example, you're already accessing acute mental health support, or, in the best case scenario, a waiting list of many years.
Yeah, go ahead, Sophia.
Oh, right, okay. So, for example, in Forth Valley, as everyone knows, that the autism pathways closed down recently. But if you have significant mental health difficulties, you can go through psychology. So that takes someone to get to a crisis point to then have access to an assessment. The ADHD pathway was closed down many years ago, citing shortages of medication. So that's been there for a long time there.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to add that at the moment it just seems that seemingly each local authority just does what it's minded to do. There doesn't seem to be any oversight or accountability. There's no national plan, so a local authority can close a pathway or can have its own thresholds for pathways, and that's just how it is. And then, so it is what everyone always calls the postcode lottery. And waiting lists are the same. Some waiting lists are longer in some areas, but in other areas you don't even have a waiting list, because there is no waiting list because there's no service. Yeah, so and people are, maybe we'll come on to this later, but I'll say it now anyway. People are actually going into debt because GPs know what the waiting times are, and GPs are telling people who go to them to try to be referred for assessment to go for a private assessment. Because I know certainly in my area 7 to 10 years maybe, and that's not unusual, I don't think. We do have a pathway, although it's not a combined pathway, which that I'm sure will come up later. So people are spending money to go and get an assessment, and then if that leads to a diagnosis, because obviously they're paying for the assessment, and they may not get a diagnosis. People usually do, but they might not. And then they will go back to their GP, and then they will be told, oh, but that wasn't an NHS assessment. So we're not going to recognise that, actually. We're not going to, if it's ADHD, we're not going to do shared care. They end up with a piece of paper they've paid quite a lot of money for, that a GP or some other clinician may have told them to go and get. It's not good, because there's no national guidance, I think.
Okay.
It's worth recognising as well that there's not
there is a willingness. It's not a lack of willingness. Practitioners and diagnosticians want to be able to support and help people, but they're so completely overwhelmed because of the way that understanding of neurodivergence has changed in recent years, that they're not able to meet the demand that's out there. They're not able to offer support to people because the support isn't there. So it's challenging, isn't it? Because it's incredibly frustrating to go and usually after many years of getting to the point of starting to understand what might be going on in your life, and being able to talk about it and being able to seek support. And then not being able to access that, and equally frustrating for those practitioners who know what a difference it would make, but they're not in a position to meet that demand as well.
Okay. I don't know if, Matthew, you have anything to add to that part?
Not really. It's all been said.
Okay. So I'm thinking about in the previous session we heard about misdiagnosis, but then you're talking about failure to diagnose, and Sophia, you've just mentioned that some people then end up in a crisis point before they can get any support or help. So I'm interested to hear any other examples about consequences of failure to diagnose or misdiagnosis within the people that you work with.
Okay, so an example would be not assessing for ADHD. That's quite a big thing, particularly for women, with the whole interaction of ADHD hormones and female hormones. If that's not seen properly, then females can't access correct hormonal support. Then there's also been prescribed the wrong medicine. For example, I had a case of someone who was refused ADHD assessment after successfully getting an autism diagnosis, but then being prescribed sertraline, which then it just made the ADHD worse, to the point where the person sustained an injury because of the hyperactivity and the inability to maintain focus or just have a bit of stableness. It actually made it worse. Another one, the misdiagnosis, which happens quite often, is being general anxiety disorder or bipolar is what we get when we're saying, no, but I think I'm ADHD. So then, if someone's ADHD, they're not being looked at. There's a difference between burnout and depression, sleep issues, because they're also autistic, and then being prescribed antidepressants for sleep, but then because of the ADHD, they can't take medication consistently. And that's the whole understanding of ADHD, which is not there. Not being able to take antidepressants consistently has its consequences. So this person then was experiencing suicide ideation because of this. And then the understanding of the high risk of suicide in ADHDers, or with people who also have trauma. And these all come together. Having CPTSD, ADHD, autism, all these things are very common in one person. And not understanding the person holistically will lead to them being prescribed the wrong medication, and then, unfortunately, can have bad consequences.
Okay. So I'll just quickly come to issues around neurodivergence in specific groups such as ethnic minority populations and also women and girls. So to what extent do you consider that current policy and pathways in place in Scotland meet the needs of ethnic minority people and women and girls, for instance, or, as we're hearing, don't meet the needs?
Take it time. Yeah. So I'll respond, but I think we can all contribute. But given this one is a charity that's focused on working with women, girls, and non-binary people, I'll start. I think in general the pathways fail to take gender into consideration at all, really, largely because they're using diagnostic practices and diagnostic tools that were developed a very long time ago, before there was really any kind of awareness or understanding that it was even possible for women and girls to be autistic. And autism can present very differently across genders for a number of reasons. So the tools that are used for assessment and diagnosis are not really fit for purpose a lot of the time for women and girls and people of other genders. They don't really tease out the way that autism might present in us in the same way. They don't necessarily pick things up. I think there's also a much lower awareness generally in how autism presents and what the reality is for being an autistic woman or an autistic girl. So that awareness isn't really there amongst practitioners, amongst GPs, amongst educators, employers, families, etc., and ourselves as well. You know, a huge proportion of us have no idea that we're autistic until we're in our 40s, 50s, even later. So if we've not got that awareness, you know, we can't. It's no surprise that it's not there. Women are much more likely to mask, much more likely to act in a particular way to try to fit into society, and that's very much. It's very common for women in our society. We do live in a gendered society anyway, and much more so if you're autistic, so it's less likely to be picked up. And there isn't that understanding and those tools and that openness to listening to and believing, I think, autistic women to pick up what's really going on. And to go back to diagnosis, we are often told it's just you're anxious, it's just your hormones, why don't you try this, why don't you try that? So I think, you know, it's not really sort of fit for purpose. We're frequently dismissed or invalidated when we do finally go and seek help. And, you know, the cost of that, obviously it's costly to resource a massive change in the way that we're diagnosing things, in the way that the pathways are put together, but there really does need to be a shift. The diagnostic process is not fit for purpose. It's quite humiliating. It focuses on deficits, on making yourself incredibly vulnerable and talking about all the ways that you fail in society. But the impact of not having that pathway in place in terms of mental health, in terms of suicide figures, in terms of medication and patient care and things that Sophia was describing before is obviously much more costly in a range of ways. But there certainly needs to be, I think, some quite significant change in order that moving forward we're not waiting until we're 50 and 60 to be diagnosed. Men or boys tend to be diagnosed, not all, but more often younger. So there's not this kind of huge influx and huge burden of people looking for diagnosis, and there's not that impact of living most of the way through your life, not knowing who you are, what your needs are and how to have those met as well. I don't know if you want to add to that as well.
I've got something
to
say. Do you mind if I go first? I'm short. In all ways. So I think the main crux of it for me, I agree with what's just been said, but I think it can really be helped by diagnosticians really keeping up with research and learning about what it's actually like to be autistic from community groups, so all kinds of community groups. Really having a relationship and understanding autism from the inside, because I think at the moment a lot of clinicians they don't tend to have autistic friends, and the only time they meet autistic people is in that clinic, which is a very scary place, and they've got their they've got their assessment that they have to go through, and it's all really sterile. And I think that it would really be of benefit if they could actually get out into the wild a bit more. I know that sounds weird, but also I think that recruitment of diagnosticians from different backgrounds as well, like actively trying to encourage people to go into that field so that they can more relate to different people who end up sitting in front of them for an assessment. That's it. I'll let Sophia go.
So I was approached by a person wanting to look into assessments, and the person had asked me is, do you know a clinician who either is minority ethnic or has experience working for minority ethnic, because I want to be assessed by somebody who actually understands me better. And the answer to that was, no, I don't know anybody who is minority ethnic who can privately diagnose. But there is somebody who has experience with. Now, like KB just said, we significantly lack representation and that understanding from the inside. The first barrier that I have seen since working with CIMA here is that in our communities, people are not encouraged to go seek an assessment because of the understanding of autism and ADHD first. And then when you're talking about masking, we've also got the code switching as well for minorities. And the masking is extremely higher if you're black or brown and female as well, because the way we are in our communities, the gender roles are so it's so emboldened. Like a lot of the autistic women that I speak to, they're told since childhood they're too masculine for being girls, and then we have to. In a lot of our cultures, it's almost akin to ABA, where we are trained to behave in a certain way, and there's customs, and not be true to ourselves. So we get to the point that the mask just slips and we hit crisis point and we don't know what's happening and we can't connect with our own communities, and we're struggling with work, home, relationships, education, and on the surface of it, it looks like it's racism, and it is. A lot of the time we are facing this prejudice that, no, the difference is, and this is something I even heard yesterday as well, was when we're asking for support, and the difference in our culture as autistic people is put down to racial culture. And there's a thing called autistic culture, and it's only when you're with autistic people that you actually understand that it goes across different cultures. So we are first judged by the fact that, no, it's a different way of doing things because they have a different ethnicity, but actually there's also a different way of thinking because they're neurodivergent. That there's layers of there that we ourselves have to uncover first before we can start advocating using the right language to seek assessment. And then when we're at the assessment, asking a GP to refer us, we get told, but you've done so well so far. Why would you want to have an assessment? I've had lots of people from our support group saying this. Like, you've got children, you've got a degree, you're working very well, why do you need an assessment here? And then there's things like when you're sitting in front of the person doing the assessment, i.e. like clinician, and you're asked about how your support needs are. Now, for somebody who's like myself, I can only give myself an example right now, being asked about, like, you don't need any help because you talk very well, you speak eloquently, right? So that's the first thing we get from our own community and professionals. You speak too eloquently, you don't need support, why do you want a diagnosis? And then but you look after yourself very well, so your support needs can't be that bad. But then because of the way I'm dressed, like, no one could actually assume, like, when did I last brush my hair? Who knows? Because I've got it all tied up. The way I dress is all masked up, and that's my culture, and I've been brought up in a way to mask everything anyway. So having a clinician saying, okay, she doesn't have high support needs, or even understand that support needs can be fluctuating. There's like lack of understanding of that completely. There's also presumptions, and they don't understand. This is something I said to my own psychiatrist who did my diagnosis. He said, you must be very mild. And I said to him, I'm not mild when I can't speak or when I can't drink water and I need help and I don't have anyone to help me. But then if I've got to this point in my life with degrees or a business or working with my children, you don't understand, or you didn't even ask me how many times was I suicidal to get to this point. Those questions are not asked. Like, we got to this point for survival's sake because as racialised autistics, as racialised people, we've just been told to get on with it. As kids, when we used to have, the P word shouting at us and all that, we were just told to put your head down. You can't ask for help. You can't ask for support. You can't put your head up because you get put down because they'll kick us out at any point. I had that when I was a teenager. I had this last year. I had this last month. So why would we put our head up across and ask for support when we know that we're not understood, we're marginalised, so many different angles?
I'm just wondering, just a final question, convener. Just is there work underway to improve diagnostic tools for allied health professionals, for instance? Because we heard in the previous session that they reduced the waiting list from 4 years to 6 months, and it was the speech and language allied health professional, the speech and language therapist, that basically took the role on of doing the assessment. So is there work underway to improve diagnosis?
There has been. Certainly, we have been assessing for about 5 or 6 years and had a contract with in Edinburgh. After a couple of years of doing that, the waiting list was a few months, but that stopped. So there are pockets of things out there, but I would say the trajectory is downwards. The waiting lists are being closed, and that people who are working in the NHS who are assessing, I don't see a lot of training going into new ways of thinking about that. Any of the stuff that Kay mentioned about kind of embedding themselves a bit more within the autistic community and get a broader understanding rather than just a clinical one. I don't see that happening. I see that going backwards.
Okay.
I think there might be some changes sort of down to specific practitioners, as you've said, who might be a bit more aware, might be autistic or neurodivergent themselves, or have people in their lives, and they've sort of taken that burden on themselves to make a bit of an effort. But I think where we are currently, there's obviously work being done by the National Autism Implementation Team to look at kind of changing pathways, but I think that there's such an issue with there being pathways at all and there being assessments at all that nobody is taking a step back and looking at, can we change the tools that we're using and make this a better process? Because there isn't the space for that, I don't think, right now. I think the focus is so much on, oh my goodness, can we even handle this? We're not, we don't have the capacity to do anything. So there isn't that additional capacity, I think, to look more broadly at the tools that are being used, because the tools are not even being used in most cases that do exist. But I think that could make a huge difference. I think more kind of education and understanding and a little bit of space and investment in that time. But as you've said, Matthew, I think that the trajectory is very much kind of moving far away from having space for that kind of reflection and improvement at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Karen Morgan.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Convener. So, yeah, thanks. Thanks very much for coming along today. The theme I'm going to cover is the impact on individuals of receiving a diagnosis or waiting a long time for a diagnosis. And I know you have touched on that in the first question. So I wonder, what is the role of diagnosis in a neuro-affirming society? How much difference does that make? Does somebody want to? Yeah, of course.
We're not in one.
Okay.
I don't think so. I worry about that question a bit because I worry that the implication of a potential answer of it doesn't have a role in a neuro-affirming society leads commissioners of services to think what we need is another campaign of awareness raising because that's all we need. We don't need diagnosis. I worry about that. We're not in a neuro-affirming society, so I'd say I'd find it difficult to answer it anyway, but I worry about if that's just what we're aiming for and we're not going to think about diagnosing in the meantime.
Okay. Does somebody else want to come in? Or is that...
I found this question really confusing because I didn't know if you were trying to imply that you thought that we did live in a neuro-affirming society, which we absolutely don't. I don't think I know any neurodivergent person who would say we did. So, yeah, I found the question a bit confusing because if we lived in a neuro-affirming society, life would be so different. I think we'd know when we got there whether the role of diagnosis was still important or not. But it definitely is now, and we know that now, and we're not. Feels like we're a million miles away from. We can have small islands of neuroaffirming practice, but to say a neuroaffirming society.
Yep.
I think that there are two very different questions there. One of them is what's the role of diagnosis for neurodivergent people to survive and thrive in our current society, and how must society change in order to become neuroaffirming? They're two very different things. I don't think that question of diagnosis in a neuroaffirming society, as you've said, is... I don't think we could answer it. We were all very, very kind of challenged, I think, by that question. I think, yes, my personal view, on paper, we shouldn't need to be medicalised and pathologised for who we are. You know, if we go back a few decades, you were diagnosed as being gay, and we've kind of realised how ridiculous that is. However, currently, it's the model that we have, and it's fundamental to affirming and confirming people's identity, and to then kind of moving forward with generally putting your own support and information in place. So we can, absolutely, we can't say, it's fine, we don't need diagnosis, because we're absolutely not there at the moment. But alongside that, we need to very much think about how our society can change to recognise neurodivergence as a very normal part of humanity. We are all neurodiverse in this room. Some of us are neurodivergent, some of us are neurotypical, we're all neurodiverse, the same way that we're culturally diverse, the same way that the world is biodiverse. So being neurodiversity is normal and natural, but as humans we don't really like that. We like things to be the same. And so currently we're in a position where we are not neuroaffirming, we're very much othering anyone who's not neurotypical, and that's, I think, what needs to change. But in the meantime, we need diagnosis to be able to access the support that we need.
I think this question kind of ignores the fact that we still have disabled bodies, though, and we still need assessment of needs that will fluctuate throughout our lives, whether we're male or female or different parts of our lives, premenopause, menstrual, like all those parts, hypermobility. There's so many different parts of our bodies that need extra support and help, and for that you do need assessment of needs. It doesn't matter how accepting, the social model of disability is, it still needs to take into account that individuals still have needs that need to be looked after, will need certain therapies and medications to help them get along with their day, just like every other disability. It's a hidden disability, which is why it kind of gets overseen.
I appreciate everybody's response to that, and it really gives us a lot to think about in terms of how, when we're reporting back, how we place those things. One of the other questions that I had was, what impact can a neurodevelopment diagnosis have on people's mental health and well-being? And I think you obviously have brought that in already, understandably. So I might put that back to people, but also ask what actions would enable more neurodiverse people to access support to improve their well-being. So, what could we be doing just now to help improve people's well-being? If anybody would like to add to that, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, I was hoping that you weren't going to skip these questions.
No, not at all. Not at all.
So, starting first with what impact can a diagnosis have, and we have sort of, there is a kind of a bit of a difference between diagnosis and identification, but that I suppose is more to do with the last question. So, basically, it's massive. It's really about knowing who we are and being able to understand ourselves and being able to understand what's going on for us as a way to get our needs met. Everyone has the right to know who they are, and everyone has the right to know, not where they've come from, but maybe where they're going. I don't know. Anyway, so before identification, I think it can just feel like we don't fit in, that we're wrong, everything we try is doomed to failure, and that's because we, right from kind of nursery age, right from the time, sometimes younger, but right from the time we start getting out there in the community, we're told, well, I don't know why, I don't know why that's so noisy. I don't know why that's so scratchy. I don't know why you're upset. Well, other people don't feel that way, constantly. And we just don't know why. And it's like a slow kind of an indoctrination in that, well, you must be wrong. If everyone else doesn't feel that way, it's got to be a problem with you. It's got to be something wrong with you. And that can just lead to really poor mental health and suicidal ideation, and sometimes people going through with that, because it's like, I don't know, it's kind of like any minority group in a way, but it's the whole of society just constantly almost feels like you're being pointed at, and people are saying it's your fault when it's not our fault. We're just like Lindsay said, we're just part, humanity's diverse and we're just part of that. There's nothing actually wrong with us. We might need some support and we might have needs. Everyone has needs. Everyone in this room has needs. Everyone has needs. They're just different needs. I think I might repeat myself, so I won't do that. It's just all about however hard we try, being seen as wrong, and being an identification of that or a diagnosis of that can be such a relief. And to enable more support and improving well-being, more funding is a big thing. And I'd say better trained clinicians and less gatekeeping to assessment, because the gatekeepers, it's so difficult to even get onto a waiting list. And recognising that needs aren't wants. We don't just want things, we need them. Yeah, a bigger understanding from society as a whole. I think I've probably... I need to say that a change in education, the education system, that we have to do something pretty huge with the education system, because at the moment children just aren't being able to access education, and that right from a young age then does have that knock-on effect for the rest of your life if you're getting all of those negative messages and not being able to access an education.
Okay. Thank you. Somebody else wants to come in? Yeah.
If you permit me, I'd like to back up and illustrate what KB said with a couple of quotes. Now, these are not things I prepared for today. They actually happened to come over my desk on Friday because we were putting together a funding report. But this is people talking about the difference it did make to their well-being. And I think it's always important, whilst we're here talking from our own experience, to bring that in. So literally the first few that I was handed by a member of staff on Friday, people talking about the impact of a diagnosis. I don't hate myself anymore. I was an inpatient. My mental health team are so happy now because I've found words and understanding to my life that I didn't have before. I'm relieved at finding that after all these decades, I'm not strange or stupid. I'm just autistic. It's made me realise I'm not alone in the way that I think and experience things, and I feel understood for the first time in my 40-plus years, and so my depression has less of a hold on me. And last year I tried my hardest to disappear from a world that simply didn't want me. Now I have a space and a people that have said that it's more than okay to be me. I don't quite know who me is yet, but it feels okay to stay in the world and start looking. Now, I hear that every day, and it always still gives me... it makes me quite emotional to hear that something so simple and is so incredibly huge and life-changing for people. And it absolutely, I think, illustrates what you said, that we've had these kind of, this minority stress that's built up all the way through our lives, that there's something wrong with us. And if we just understood that we're perfectly normal neurodivergent people, it would change an awful lot. But there does need to be an investment in that. I think there needs to be an investment in doing some really difficult reflection, I think, as well, on, where there is gatekeeping, where we're kind of actually listening to and involving neurodivergent people, where we're moving beyond inclusion and sort of tokenism, and it is challenging. But I think that kind of understanding that people need to be able to be truly safe to be openly neurodivergent in public roles, in employment, in education, so that there's more real visibility, not just celebrities on television. I'm sure we all know between us a lot of people who don't feel comfortable. In fact, we know very well there's people in this building that don't feel comfortable disclosing their identity because they know it will affect their careers. If there was more safety to do that, people would see themselves reflected in other people. They would see that the lives that they're safe and able to have, and we would feel less wrong, and it would have less impact on our mental health. But there's some hard work, I think, to be done within society to do that, and to create spaces where people are able to do that, and to have people leading on some of those areas of work. That when we are going out and talking to allied health professionals, when we're creating neuroaffirming communities of practice, where are all the neurodivergent professionals that are leading those areas of work, and creating that sort of safety and visibility for people to understand, and to understand that they are normal and they are valid, and it's okay to be who they are, because we're all surrounded by people that are different and have different needs. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, and thanks for sharing the quotes, of course. Sophia?
Just go back to what Kaylee said there. It's a report came, I think it was last year, over 90% of homeschoolers or home learners are autistic. When Kaylee was talking about the access to school, it's no wonder that majority of them who can't access are actually neurodivergent, autistic. There's quite a lot there, I just don't know which order to put it in. When you're talking about why it's so needed, it's that whole not being believed. Now, if you're not being believed as an autistic person or autistic female, then imagine what it's like being black or brown autistic, and you're perceived as your assertiveness as aggression, and when you're pursuing needs and it's not a want, it's a need, you're out, there's this perception that you just want meds. That's all, you're only here to get a prescription, that's all. And this is what actually happens. There's so many layers, like knowing that you're autistic or ADHD improves relationships because you know yourself better. It'll help you understand that, oh, I'm in a relationship that's not good for me, and it'll empower you because you've got improved mental health, because you have better understanding, and you're around people who understand you. It's not just me. Like, ADHDers will attract narcissists like any businessman. There's lots of information about this. You know, we're living in 2025 where all this information is, people are sharing their experiences now more so, and I think practitioners from all sorts of fields of support need to join them all up together. When autistic people have the highest rate of suicide, have the highest rate of being abused and domestic abuse. If you go and put them together, like I said earlier, having CPTSD and being neurodivergent is not a surprise to anybody here. If we were to have proper support services that are holistic, it comes to a point where, and I've had this in our community groups, is that the need is like we're now interacting with 5 or 6 different professionals to get support because we're in burnout and crisis mode. It gets to the point where there's too many professionals involved, because it's just got so bad from different angles. For example, court, police, social work, education, SOT, OT, you know, and the schools, all in one family, social work as well. So I've mentioned it, but it becomes so profound at that end point where it's like, what are you supposed to do? And what we're not actually haven't mentioned here, autistic families, children, and adults. So you're a carer, you have your own needs, you're autistic, you're a carer, you've, let's say, have an abusive relationship, can't access employment because the recruitment processes are so linear and sequential. Even last week I've had this, somebody telling me that they couldn't get a job because their answers were not sequential, even though the person said, my answers will not be sequential because I have ADHD. And if we can't get access to jobs, we can't access to security, financial or housing security, and we have, again, education issues with our own children, autistic children, who are then having barriers to going to school, but we're not believed because we're the problem. This is what our families are facing, and it has to be holistic and understanding that it's multidimensional. We are multidimensional humans. It needs to be more joined up understanding, and that comes back to holistic training. It's not just about neuroaffirming. We have to have anti-racism practices, universal design. We need to be inclusive because all of these are connected systems of oppression that need to be addressed.
Thank you. Is there, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just to say, obviously, a lot of good stuff's been said. Listening to Lindsay's, we hear those kinds of things all the time. It chokes you up. But just thinking about, you mentioned the impact of a diagnosis. I think it's important that the impact of not having a diagnosis for a lot of neurodivergent people that I've worked with who later received a diagnosis, the impact of not getting it earlier was that they ended up in prison, or that they've been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, what's now emotionally unstable personality disorder, particularly for women who were seen as too aggressively seeking a diagnosis. That when we meet them, it was very clear that they're autistic. But this, the way that they push for that, for their needs to be met, was seen as some kind of personality disorder. So not getting that diagnosis earlier can be a problem. And just also, I think there's definite issues in terms of more women finding it difficult to get through that point of diagnosis earlier, but also class issues. I think if you're not as articulate as a parent, what often happens, I see women in their 20s, 30s, whose parents, suggested that they might be autistic when they were younger at school. First thing that happens is CAMHS send a letter to the school asking if there's any problems. No problems at school because they just keep their head down, and then it's seen as a parenting issue, and people are sent on parenting classes. I know a parent who was taken to court for not sending her daughter to school, and I know her daughter as an adult, and she tells me she couldn't get out of the door and that her mum used to try and drag her, but instead of helping her, she was taken to court. So there's a big impact of not having that diagnosis, certainly.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Joe Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for coming along. Good morning. I almost thought you were coming on to my areas in the last question there. I was wanting to ask about training and understanding in kind of wider context, because clearly we know that obviously GPs are the gatekeeper, but everyone's interaction is with a lot more folk in public life and I guess across society. So I guess where I want to start with is around that understanding. So is there something that we or the Scottish Government should or could be doing to address some of the stigma, misinformation and discriminatory attitudes which neurodivergent people experience?
I'd say one of the things that springs to mind again is schooling. So I'm not a fan of segregated schooling, and I don't mean that I think that all children should be sitting in a classroom at a desk doing the same work all together. I mean that we need to probably reduce class sizes and start looking at the schools as they should be, like little mini communities that are supporting whoever. Everyone should be able to go to their local school, and the school should be able to support whoever that is. But that takes smaller class sizes, that takes funding. I mean, there's a crisis with PSAs. Have I got that right? Yeah. PSAs, there's a crisis in everything at the moment, it feels. But it just seems to me that if you don't have an integrated school, and if you aren't teaching from a very young age about what society is and who the members of our communities are, and you're segregating some people, and some people end up being segregated because they can't actually manage to get into school, because for so many neurodivergent people, school is a hostile environment, and that's not too much of a strong word. It really is hostile. It's awful for many, many reasons. So, but I think, yeah, also I think it's already been said that, you know, it's a reminder that you can't tackle one form of stigma or discrimination. It has to be holistic. You have to look at everything.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to? Sophia? Yep.
So I'm a teacher, so I want to go back on saying that, yes, teacher training. A lot of young people get missed in primary school, and then it comes up to high school. The transition from primary to secondary can be quite traumatic for young people, and that's when they become more apparently autistic or ADHD, as well as the adolescents hitting on. So teacher training needs to be improved. We need to have the training done by professionals who are themselves neurodivergent and not just co-produced. That's not good enough. It needs to be done by professionals who are living it. And just like I would say, you wouldn't have a white person giving anti-racism training or a man saying, I'll give you training on menopause. It's the same with this. You have to have training and you to have representation, because then we will have teachers who are neurodivergent in our schools who manage to get in by some luck, can't stay in, because the same hostile environment that affects the children will affect those teachers if they don't stay in either, and there's a progression. And if they are in the decision-making spaces, they can make more inclusive and holistic decisions that will improve the communities. And the schools are many communities that reflect outside the world as well. So that's one. And then within the Scottish Government, you'll need to have more representation, because then naturally you will have that insight and understanding of what needs to change, because you can see the problems from the inside, but having people who have the ability and power to make those changes and decisions, who are from the inside with that lived experience, is important.
Thank you. Lindsay?
No, I mean, I think I would absolutely agree with what you've said. I think that particularly that, you know, that last point of, it goes back to what you said, I think, about people going out and actually meeting more people that are neurodivergent and kind of having those more natural communities that we learn through empathy and understanding, don't we? We all actually sort of change our minds, our hearts and minds, because, oh, I know somebody and I get it now. I understand that you will feel terrible after sitting under bright lights, or, you know, something quite simple. It's not always a huge drama, but if we all felt safe in this room to express things like that, then we start to learn about one another, and we kind of naturally develop that knowledge. So I think that's a really important point. I suppose, other than education, another area where I see huge issues is in the workplace. There's a massive focus on getting autistic people into work, and quite rightly so, because the unemployment figures are incredible, or horrendous. However, it does mean that we are seen as potentially only being valid if we're contributing to the economy. I think that there are a huge number of autistic people who are in work, who are incredibly successful at their careers, and who end up not being able to sustain that employment because of bullying and harassment. And, you know, as you've said, there are statistics out there that sort of back all of this up. 50% of autistic employees report experiencing bullying, harassment and discrimination at work. I work with a number of incredibly high-level professional women particularly, most of whom at some point end up facing a disciplinary at work or going off with mental health issues. And these disciplinaries tend to be based around, well, somebody didn't like the tone that you wrote in an email, or they didn't quite like the way that you gave your feedback to somebody that you're supervising. Now, meanwhile, and this is very true because of the type of society that we live in, men, whether neurodivergent or neurotypical, are allowed to be assertive and blunt and straight to the point. Women are expected to be softer and do the sort of social housework and be gentler, and it's a challenge that we all face in the world of work. If you add to that being autistic and communicating, moving, acting in a slightly different way, a bit like the parent that was seen as being, or the person that was seen as being aggressive for being kind of very focused on what they were doing, it doesn't fit and it doesn't sit well. A lot of autistic people really excel in their jobs, and it makes other people uncomfortable because they feel like they look bad because we have real attention to detail, we tend to be perfectionists, and so it can cause issues, it causes bullying in the workplace. So I think we need to look at both ends of that spectrum within employment. We need to look at people being able to access employment and access appropriate employment for their skills and not be underemployed or unemployed, but also sustaining employment. There needs to be a real change. Of course, we've got equality, employment law in place and inequalities law. Of course, in principle, we're allowed to ask for adjustments, but we all know that the reality of that is not the same. And people are ending up out of work, ending up unwell and on medication because of what they're facing. Now, the answer to that's not simple, but I think it feeds into everything else, that we need that sort of change of attitude and understanding. And that societal change to be able to be a bit more open about who we are and learn from one another. But certainly in terms of that sort of focus on employment, I think we need to think a wee bit more broadly about what the reality is for people, because it goes from school through higher education and employment, if you're lucky enough or in a position to want to be able to do that. That bullying and that othering and that sort of constant battle follows you all the way through, doesn't it?
Thank you. Matthew?
Yeah, not a lot to add. The first thing I always think whenever asked, what can we do, is what resources have you got to do it? That would be nice to know. But it's not all about resources. It is about attitude, and it is about culture. And I think, as mentioned earlier, I think we know people who work within Scottish Government who don't feel able to tell their employers. I actually diagnosed someone who didn't want the letter to be sent to the GP because there may come a point where GP records could be accessed, and therefore Scottish Government would know, the employer would know that he's autistic. So I think getting things right in-house, and I'm not saying that's easy, that's going to be every employer is going to have these kind of issues, but getting them right in-house is important before starting to think about external to Scottish Government, for me.
That's very good, thank you. And obviously one of the issues that we've got some evidence around is that sometimes that organisations, employers, public service don't use the right language, and sometimes the language that is being used is in itself just reinforces the discrimination, reinforces the stigma. So just, I guess, an opportunity to kind of see how that can be rectified to some extent, and any thoughts on how we can improve that situation? Anyone that has that?
It is definitely important, because the language that people use does, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, does inform their actions and the way they think about things. I don't know, I feel there's a bit of an elephant in the room, but I know that no one else has mentioned it yet, what the inquiry's called. ASD doesn't tend to be a very popular term within the autistic community at all. We've kind of moved away from using it. So I would say part of it is lead by example, but you have to be in contact with neurodivergent people's organisations you know, to be kept up to speed, if that's the right term. Like you would for any kind of minority group, you have to be sensitive to what's being used within their community, to be sensitive to, you know, the right things to use, the right ways to use, and have that probably across the Scottish Government, because I have noticed, you know, well, this is Parliament, isn't it? Parliament, Government, both. I have noticed that there's quite a difference. Like, you know, in one area, they'll be using certain terminology, and sometimes, you know, one of us will try and encourage them to be slightly different, maybe. And then the next week, you'll see it will pop up somewhere else, and a different department or whatever will be using different terminology again. So I think, yeah, the Scottish Government and the Parliament should be trying to get it right. More recently, I think they've been doing a better job, but the title of this inquiry is a bit odd. Anyone else?
Let's just get the elephant sorted, and you know, what should we have? If we've made a mistake, then you know the committee hasn't done that deliberately, and it'd be good to kind of hear what would be a preferred terminology.
I would have used, I can't remember what the full title was, but probably just autism.
Yeah, I mean, so ASD is autistic spectrum disorder, and we don't consider ourselves to have a disorder, and most autistic people don't. It's old medical language. In terms of kind of how to word this, not generally in the community at the moment, and language does change, there's a preference to say that we are autistic people rather than people with autism, because it's just the type of person we are. It's not a thing that we've got and we caught and we might get rid of. So I guess ADHD and autism pathways and support inquiry.
Or pathways for autistic
pathway, yeah.
people. No, just not ASD.
It gets complicated linguistically when you put them both together. But I think some people use ASC, which is condition, but again, it suggests that it's an illness or something that you've acquired. And I think we do have to really move past that, because it's inaccurate. It's Mac or PC. You know, it's a different operating system. It's not a wrong one, and it's always kind of been like that. But certainly, yes, autism generally rather than using ASD, much as that might be the medical terminology. And I think I mean you're absolutely right about that kind of being open to having that conversation, and for us as well, being able to have that conversation openly and just asking people. It's the same with any minority language. If you're not quite sure, ask somebody what language they prefer to use, I guess.
Yeah, so I think that was really, really helpful for us, because I think it probably goes deeper. It sounds like just a couple of letters and a word, but from the way you've expressed it, you know, the difference between someone with autism and an autistic person, when you actually think about it and you've explained it, I think really clearly, that is really helpful to the committee for us to consider. So this is clearly a bit of training in the kind of wider sense for us here. And the whole morning's been really good, and all the evidence has been really helpful to all of us. How can we get some of that discussion going on in wider society, particularly in public service? But you know, because everyone in public service will come across autistic people on a daily basis, and how do we make sure that a wider number of people understand the right words to use, you know, what can make a difference to make someone who is autistic have a more positive experience, which would then be a more positive experience for both sides of a conversation, both sides of a transaction. Anyone? Just.
It's a big question, isn't it?
It's a big question, but yeah, take it whichever way you want.
I'd start by saying lead by example. You know, lead by example. Try to get things right in your own workplaces, in your own constituencies and things, the people that you work with, and again going out to meet people, talking to people. But so there are things that can be done, such as like smaller things, like service providers, including the NHS, I think should be listening to what works. So they should be listening to people who've had a good experience, finding out why it was a good experience, and maybe using those islands of good experience to then educate other departments or other areas in the NHS. I think there are people often say to me that there are, like with breast care, it's often really good because they give you You know, just the way they talk to you, the information you get beforehand, the way they do things, and they say, if only they did it like that in, you know, a different department, in the same hospital, so they can get it right here, but they're not like getting it right somewhere else. And for some reason, OTs, occupational therapists, seem to be like the best. Yeah,
I find them being the best.
Yeah. So yeah, shared experience between roles and working out how to get it right by asking autistic people or other neurodivergent people who use those services, because we know how it goes right and wrong.
Okay, thank you. Yep, Lindsay.
And I think that it's sort of, I don't know if you want your planning to answer this separately, but it kind of moves into that area of training as well, doesn't it?
Cover it just now.
So there's a few, there's a few things in there. I think obviously we're looking at mandatory training as part of the Learning Disabilities and Autism and Neurodivergence Diversity Bill, however we ended up getting it called. And there's a sort of approach at the moment that's been discussed in having a two-tier level of mandatory training for people in public sector, which I think is appropriate. However, I think that we need to get that absolutely right, because otherwise it's going to be a waste of time. And I think that there's probably at the moment a focus on training being for people that we think will come into contact with autistic people. So it is the OTs and the SLTs, and they do get it right because that's their profession and it's what they want to be good at. But we need to remember that, yes, autistic people are going to get cancer checks, and autistic people are having babies, and autistic people are breaking their legs, and autistic people are turning up in A&E, and they're also in inpatient care. And training around being treated well and being listened to when, for example, you're in hospital makes an enormous amount of difference. But I think we need to remember that that training needs to be for everyone, because we're everywhere. We walk among you. So we're accessing the public sector. We're also turning up to the council to pay our council tax and, you know, whatever the things are that we're doing. So I think we need to kind of look broadly and remember that there needs to be that sort of awareness of language, of just listening to people as well, wherever they are. When somebody tells you, I can't be in a big busy ward because I'm autistic, they're not. It is a want, a need and not a want. I think that's a really, really good phrase. But I think also that second tier, that more in-depth training, again, needs to be delivered to the right people, and it needs to be specialised. So it does need to be specialised around perinatal and pregnancy and childbirth care. It needs to be specialised around acute mental health care, around turning up in A&E and crisis. Where are we arriving? Where are we seeking support for domestic abuse? Where are we seeking support for eating disorders? Because this is where we're all ending up when we do get to crisis. So that understanding of how we present in those situations needs to be invested in. So the work has been done under the LDAN bill, but it needs to be done right to get it right. And absolutely, to go back to your point, it has to be led by neurodivergent professionals. And that is not us sitting here touting for business. Mm-hmm. It's true. Like you said, you would not go to a white woman to talk to you about a black woman's experience. You wouldn't go necessarily to a white man to hear about menopause if you had the choice of somebody who has that lived experience, who's also a professional. And we attend a lot of meetings in government where we say that often, and it's not heard properly. It's not heard properly, and it's very challenging because it's difficult for us not to get to the point of maybe we're saying it too often and we're just being difficult. I think that there seems to be a barrier to really understanding that there are loads of autistic surgeons and social workers and politicians and elected members and leads of council and nurses and midwives out there. And this training needs to not just be, obviously there's a contractual process that has to be gone through. I understand things have to go out to tender, but writing a clause in that says you have to involve autistic people, and maybe you go and get a wee quote from somebody and stick it on a slide in the training, it's not going to be as effective as that being delivered by somebody who has A, the professional experience, B, the lived experience and the understanding of how to go out and involve more people. If that can change, I think it would be fundamental, and it would be fundamental to the community and to autistic people, because when we go back out to the hundreds and thousands of people that we all work with between us and tell them that after all this work, this mandatory training has been put in place and it's been delivered by a whole lot of folk that have never met an autistic person in their lives, people just walk away and say, well, here we go again, you know, it was a waste of time. So it's an opportunity, I think, to get it right. You know, we do well at that in Scotland, at doing things differently and looking at where it has gone right and where it's gone wrong and actually getting it right. And I think that in terms of trust in the process and trust that you're actually being seen and listened to, if we can start to actually listen to neurodivergent people and involve them in leading the right bits of work, that will create a significant change on all levels.
Thanks very much. Sophia, you want to come in there?
My head just keeps screaming, implementation, not just listening. We need implementation. It's not just about me saying that we need this. It's about you putting it down and actually taking action with it. Because we've been talking about this, Kiwi, you'll know, for how long now we've been talking about this. And movement is so slow because the people who can implement don't implement because they don't want to implement, they're complacent. They don't understand what you just said, the value of that. For example, I spent 10-15 minutes with my child's pastoral teacher about his needs and just experiences myself and him and of our life. And she fed back that she's learned more about being autistic in 15 minutes talking to me as a teacher and as a parent than she has in her whole career as a pastoral head in middle management. And that's just because it was lived experience from the experience on the inside. Another thing, what you were saying about the language there, language sets a preface of either getting rid of prejudice or enhancing the prejudice. And in our communities, we don't even have the language. Like, so when we try to talk about being autistic and what it's like, it's so deficit-based, it's so colonial in our communities, it's so capitalistic that when we need to have those languages to identify our real authentic experiences for us and to go forward with that and have that ability to then access support and care. And when it comes to receiving that support and care, whether it's police, NHS, we need to have that, at risk of repeating what you've said there, but I just can't emphasise it enough, that the training needs to be, it's the ones who don't want to do the training are the ones who need to do the training. That's the problematic part there. Like, I did training on autism as a teacher, and that's when the penny dropped. Like, oh, that's my child, oh, that's me. But if I hadn't done level 2, I did level 1 and walked away, then I wouldn't have known any better. It was a level 2 one where I just sat and got all this kind of criteria, understanding of myself and my child and my family, and that's how our journey started. Now, that training was not taken up very well in my local area. Not very many teachers will find a time of day to go after work to do this training because they don't think that, like, why do we need it? It's those who need it, that's what you need to understand, and not those who are just voluntarily signing up for these things, because they're already good at what they're doing because they sign up for these things. It's the people who are prejudiced enough to think and arrogant enough to think they know what they know. But the truth is, you don't know what you know. What you don't know what you don't know, basically. It's that approach that we need to put in, is making it mandatory, making it authentic.
Thank you. I'm conscious, Convener, that we're running short of time, but Matthew or Katie, do you want to say anything briefly? Or you? I saw lots of nodding, so thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Can I say, as we're approaching the time it's allocated to a session, can I ask the witnesses, if you're happy, I extend it to allow questions and answers to evidence we got by committee? Okay. Elena Whitman.
Thanks, Convener. And as a neurodivergent politician, I can absolutely tell you that this place is still not yet neuroaffirming. There's a long way to go, and it's really good to hear the way that you all have articulated that journey that we're on at the moment. I want to spend a wee bit of time, because we are short in time, round about transitions. Some of them have already been mentioned. We've got the transition, from child disability payment to adult disability payment, transitions from primary school to secondary school, transitions through the hormonal journey of a woman throughout her entire lifespan. Do you think that there's a need for a transitional framework for neurodivergent young folk when we think about them moving from child to adult services in Scotland? A lot of the time they can end up ageing out. They can be in the waiting list and then ended up at the bottom of an adult waiting list. And it feels like there's not a standardised approach to this across the country. So I'm wondering if any of you could speak to that at all.
We do. But it kind of makes me worry that we definitely do, and there should be one. But I am concerned that it might not happen. It might not be implemented. I was looking at you because you were saying that. And that we already have a lot of legislation that is just kind of ignored, like ASM legislation and other legislation. So yes, we definitely need one. but we need one that people will use. That's it.
To the point, absolutely. Anybody else have anything on that?
Yeah, I would say, because you mentioned the NHS Lothian framework in the questions, that if you're around long enough, you know, I remember in Edinburgh the transitions team, Aspire, that was disbanded. It did some great work for children hitting that kind of 16, 17, and there was a period up to, I think, 2024 that the transitions team could work, you know, helping people to access adult services, thinking about where they are on lists for children and adults. That was disbanded, and now they're looking at a very similar way of doing things, and I'm not saying that's not good, but often we've had these good bits of practice before, but money, whatever, political choices means that they get cancelled, and then it's presented as a kind of new way forward when it's been there before. These aren't new ideas, but yes, definitely.
Explain a wee bit then about what happened when that service stopped, that you know, provision was stopped over that period of time. What happened to people? Can you put a wee bit of context around that?
I can tell you, you know, from my experience, there were a few workers at Aspire who would be working with people in school, and they would be bringing them into the one-stop shops that we manage, and supporting them to access some of the groups that, you know, they were 16, 17, maybe not as confident, and there were some older people in the groups. So there was a lot more service use from those people. What we noticed is that that dropped, and people weren't. Now, we don't know who they are at that point, because we know there are people at school, but we don't know those individuals unless they're supported to access us. So it took a while until we were involved in diagnosing some of those 16, 17-year-olds before that age range was using us as much as it was when the transitions team were in place. So you notice their absence more than anything, but because we don't know who they are, I can only guess at the impact, because they're not using services. They might have been given a leaflet, but they weren't being supported to transition in the way that they were in the past, and therefore that leaflet was going into a drawer, and people were, you know, people's mental health was probably deteriorating, etc. So a lot of, not everyone, but a lot of people need a bit of support to access that transition, rather than just be given information as to where you can go.
Yeah, I think that's quite powerful for us to hear, because there's a very big difference between being handed a leaflet that has support information on it and actually being supported to access that support. So do you feel just now as if young people are getting adequate support in that transition phase, or that there's an urgent need? I can see Sophia saying absolutely not, that there's an urgent need to actually ensure that the support that they should be getting is actually being delivered? Sophia, do you want to say?
When you talk about leaflets, I just wrote down that relationships, lack of. There needs to be relationships between 16 across to 24, that transitioning, because you're not just transitioning out of school, you're also transitioning into work or education. And as soon as you're 18, you're an adult, you're expected to call a GP up yourself and make those appointments, and it's hard for an aged adult at best, to be honest, right, to get a GP appointment, let alone somebody who just entered into adult world. When it comes to your bills and all that and moving out of home, there's so much there to consider. If you had somebody who you have a relationship with, could then help you with this help that you got beforehand, for example with sleep, with moving over from child disability payment to adult disability payment, and what that looks like, or even carers if you're a carer as well. Again, autistic families. You know, it's relationships there, and they're not there. But that's what we need, is someone that we can trust, that we can talk to, and then go back to them and say, okay, having that consistency. Like we don't have that when we leave school. When you're jumping in from leaving high school to join college or university, like you were supported all your life, and then all of a sudden you go to tertiary or education, and you're back to square one, advocating for your needs in a completely different setting where everyone's an adult, but you're just new to the adult world.
I think important as well to recognise that these things are even more difficult for neurodivergent people. They're difficult for everybody. It's difficult for everyone to become an adult and start advocating for yourself and calling the GP and doing all these things that you do. But for autistic people, whether an adult or a young person, going to an organisation where you don't know anyone, you don't know where the building is, you don't know what's going to happen, is incredibly difficult, and the chances of you doing it are next to nothing. We have a lot of adults who come and access our services where we realise that we have to maybe have a kind of pre-meet with them, have a call, maybe we do a handover, a joint meeting with a support worker, with a therapist, with a friend or a family member, excuse me, to sort of build that trust, even to just come to us as an adult, so that sort of transition. And I think, you know, I'm sure there's not a health and social care partnership in the country that wouldn't like to have that in place, but the reality is that if you've been on a CAMHS waiting list for 6 years and you've still not been seen, and then you've aged out of it and you're about to then you are going to go on to another 6-year waiting list. So how does it work? How can that pathway and that handover happen? And again, it does come back to resources, but I think that your point is important, that it's a big transition period in life, and we should be really aware of that. It's the time when you're moving out of a held time of your life where you have a parent and carer, you have educators who are making decisions for you. You're going out into the world where you're trying to succeed in education, higher education or further education. You're trying to succeed in employment, and you might be trying to succeed in relationships or as a parent. And that's where you can fall through that massive crack and end up much further down the line in crisis support. And the cost of that, the cost impact of that is much, much bigger than it would be to have that handover at that time where you learn to access these services, you build a community around you, and you're sort of supported across that, rather than being left to try to face something really quite insurmountable, and particularly for those who maybe don't have that family support around them to advocate for them as well. What happens to them?
I think that really clearly set out the kind of early intervention and prevention stuff that happens in that transition space. Thank you, Convener.
To what extent is clear and consistent information provided to people seeking a diagnosis of a neurodevelopment condition, and is there scope for improvement, and how does that support and information vary across Scotland? Matthew?
It certainly does vary across Scotland, although because I do know of some areas where there is a bit of information along the way. Most areas that I'm aware of, you're on a list, you might get a letter telling you you're on a list, and then either that's it or any other information that you get is really a way of seeing if you don't reply, and therefore they can take you off the list. It's a, can we check that you still want to be on the list letter, and you've got 4 weeks to tell us that, otherwise you'll be removed from the list. That happens in a few areas. It's happened for a long time, and some people take longer than that to think about opening this letter, let alone dealing with it. So some people just get timed out of being on the waiting list. Very few people get much information at all. Some areas I know of might run some kind of groups for people on a waiting list to give information about what might come in terms of an assessment, what might be available afterwards, that kind of thing. There's a big drive in a lot of areas now, and I think I know Nate, the National Autism and Implementation Team, talk about waiting well, so what we can do for people on waiting lists. I get a bit frustrated with that because there seems to be more of a focus on what we can do for people on waiting lists than there is about assessing them. Well, let's get people assessed, and we won't have to think too much about waiting well. Let's not wait too long. But yeah, there are some areas where there's a bit of information. I would say that most areas, the only information you get is checking whether you want to remain on the list.
Anybody else? Lindsay?
Of somewhere quite good. I won't say who they are. But this is one of the quite good ones. So you get a letter to say you're on the waiting list. Thank you for returning your questionnaires. You're on the waiting list. Let us know if your details change. A year later, thanks, you're still on the waiting list. We just want to confirm that you're on the waiting list and give you some resources and support. That doesn't exist in most places. The resources and support are, here's an online website where you can learn to do some breathing exercises, and here's the number for Samaritans. And that's good. because most places you're not getting anything else. So keep breathing, stay alive, and we'll come back to you.
I'm a bit taken aback with that. How could you?
That's a good one.
How could we improve this? How can the services improve this information?
I mean, I suppose it goes back to kind of, the problem is it puts the onus, doesn't it, on individuals, I think, at the moment. I think probably have a look and see what there is in your area. What is in your area? Where can you refer people? Can they go to a group at number 6? Can they go to ARG? Can they go to CIMA? Can they come to SWAN? Now, obviously, I understand there's always a difficulty with in public sector in referring out to organisations that they're not maybe necessarily sure of quality of the support, but a lot of us are, we've been around for a long time, we're funded through government funding, etc., but certainly giving people the choice or suggesting there may well be help in your local area. Why don't you go and look? There's a lot of amazing books written by autistic people. Try reading some, or maybe could read some of them, they might help you at the moment. There can be some quite simple things, because realistically what it should be is a pathway that brings you in for an assessment, sends you out to the support that there is around. There's been money invested in the Autistic Adult Support Fund. There was in the post-diagnosis pilot previous to that. Not that everybody that's providing good services is able to access that funding, but I think that there needs to be a proper pathway of here's where you can actually get some support, whether you're waiting or whether you've got your diagnosis. Nobody's getting that. People are telling us they've waited all their lives. They've had all what we've talked about today, all of this challenge, the impact on their mental health, and they think, when I finally get my assessment, thank goodness it's going to be the answer to all my questions, and you get, that's wonderful, you're autistic, thank you. And they can't believe it. And that's whether you're on the waiting list or afterwards, that you're left with nothing. So there needs to be either provision of services or certainly signposting to what's already out there and having open conversations with people. It's fine, we know that there are waiting lists, we understand that, but what are we meant to do in the meantime? Because there are things that are out, there are things that are out there. At the moment, there's pockets of that. It tends to be where we have built relationships in our organisations with local services, where we've maybe done training for them, we've met them at meetings, we've started to build those relationships, where people are now aware, I know if it's a woman I can refer them to SWAN, I can refer them to CIMA, they're in Edinburgh, wherever they're in the Highlands, I know where I can refer them to, but it's not happening generally as part of the practice. And as I say, that's a good example. And then there's another letter a year on, you're still on the waiting list, you're still on the waiting list, and this is from 5 years ago. And what's that person meant to have done in the meantime? They're back to kind of going on Google and, if they're lucky, maybe finding some support themselves, whereas that access to services and community could have changed their lives in the meantime.
Thank you, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon to the panel. Thank you for your evidence to date. I mean, I'm really going to finish off by looking at joint working and just looking at the benefits and what you think the benefits are of involving a multidisciplinary team and undertaking that autism and ADHD assessment. And I suppose since you've raised already what the role could and should be of the third sector in supporting neurodivergent people. Who wants to take that on?
I think it's essential to have a multidisciplinary team, and I don't think we should really just be talking about autism and ADHD either, because we're missing out things like DCD and lots of other neurodivergencies that we know that once someone has been identified as having one form of neurodivergence, they might be autistic or they might be ADHD or whatever, they're way more likely to be multiply neurodivergent, so they're may way more likely to have a cluster. It's like being a bit greedy, isn't it? We don't just want one thing. But I think it is really essential to have a multidisciplinary team, and it's really essential to have a team, as we said earlier, that really understands neurodivergent people and has connection with the neurodivergent community and is up to date on current thinking. And all assessments, I believe, should be ND-wide, not just looking at one or two things, because that duplication, it wastes money, it causes stress to people, it makes the waiting list longer. It's ridiculous that someone, for example, might go for an assessment for autism, get an autism diagnosis, then have another long wait to go and get ADHD assessment, when it could have been done by the right clinicians. It could have been done all at once. Yeah, and going on to the third sector, I'd say, well, we all know it's massively underfunded, and I think as you know, small grassroots organisations in particular, it's getting harder and harder to get funding. Even though we can do quite a lot with very little money, we still need money. And also, I suppose we should, you might not think it's connected, but I do, the crisis in social care is having an impact on everything as well. Even though, I don't know, I don't think that's out of place to say that. I think it does have an impact. I can't remember if you asked the question about community-based assessment.
Not yet.
Okay, sorry.
But feel free to answer it anyway.
Well, I could answer it now if you like, but then someone else might get a go in a minute. Sorry, guys. So I think community-based assessments, because they can offer a service that's really embedded with a day-to-day connection with autistic and other neurodivergent people, because they're generally based in services, you know, places that have other services, and they are part of a community. I think that means that they are more able to support people through the process, through the whole process, the waiting, you know, getting the assessment, and then if they go on to get a diagnosis, picking up after that. And I don't know if you've read it. I hope that you've read it. The ARG was involved along with SEMA and Amaze, who unfortunately weren't invited to come, which is a shame. The experiences of autism assessment and diagnosis in Scotland, and that people in that really did cite number 6 as being a really good provision because of those reasons, because it was embedded in community and because the support went the whole way through if people wanted it to. Yeah, I mean, I do have a bit of a drawback, I see, really, is with differential diagnosis, and that we have to make sure that even when it's in a community setting, that the service understands and can react to the different kinds of people they're going to come into contact with, particularly if they're doing like a neurodivergent-wide assessment. So looking at co-occurring, not just neurodivergent, but, you know, co-occurring mental health issues that someone, you know, being autistic doesn't mean that isn't a mental illness, but it isn't, you know, no neurodivergence is protection either. So someone might well be autistic and have schizophrenia. You know, things, it's not simple, I guess. Yeah. But then I would say that about any diagnostic service, those things that I've just said. But also, like, one last point, I am a bit worried about that question because I wouldn't want it to imply that, oh, the third sector can deal with that and kind of be almost, a shoving away from the NHS, which I wouldn't like to see, even though there are benefits.
And you know, I don't think that's what the questions here for. And if just finally to layer on top of that, and we'll bring everybody else into that, it's all very well saying we, you know, a multidisciplinary team is you know, is required and is very much the way forward. But what's the reality?
It doesn't happen. Really, there may be in a lot of areas there is a team that is multidisciplined. But you, as an individual going for an assessment, don't see that team. You see one person in it. Sometimes that person goes and speaks to someone else about you, but you don't meet them. So in one area that I'm aware of, there are CPNs who are involved in taking information from people coming for assessment, going through some checklists, and then they talk to a psychiatrist who's never met the person to give the diagnosis. I'm not saying that's a terrible thing, and their resources mean that doing much more would be difficult. But when we talk about multidisciplinary diagnoses and assessments, it's rare that actually happens. It does happen in some areas, but usually you're meeting one person. There are areas where you'll meet a couple, but it's not usual. And the community based, I worry about what people think that means, because there's an implication that it's somehow a lesser assessment. It's not as maybe robust. Whereas that might not be the case, because you could go to one mental health team in one area and 8 people will have very different experiences. They'll see people who've never been trained in diagnostic tools. They'll see them once for 40 minutes and be told that they're not autistic. Now, there may be people who you could give a positive diagnosis to in 40 minutes. I don't think there's anyone who you should be saying no to in 40 minutes. So you get very different experiences within mental health teams, within the NHS. So I wouldn't want the implication to be that it's somehow lesser if it's community-based, certainly.
Okay. Does anybody else get any comments before me? Sophia? Yeah.
So, well, what Kiwi just said about the whole third sector, the turnover for the third sector is really, really high. There's insecure funding, there's lack of backing of maintain structures and growth for it, and basically the capacity. It's just like, I've been doing third sector work for the past 10-15 years now, and it's always trying to get the right people in to work with you, because you have contracts that finish within 9 months, 6 months, 12 months. You very rarely do get multi-year funding for them to actually have a career in this organisation, because everything's so temporary in third sector. But then when you're looking at how communities can support, I have to say an example from Scottish Ethnic Minority Autistics is that everyone that comes to us, they say that this is the first place that they have come to where they are completely themselves. Because when you go to one place, they're either just brown people, or go to another place, they're only just autistic people. But when they're with us, and their parents, their carers, they're struggling with work, their employees, they have been racialised, they have been experienced prejudice in different levels. It's the only place that they can actually understand themselves and be themselves, and how wonderful that is for people's mental health, for them to be empowered. Now, I don't think that community-based care should be exclusive for when it comes to diagnostics. However, we see autistic when we see autistic. Like, it's that peer review kind of thing. We understand, and we see it through the masking, we see it through the code switching, way more than a clinician who sees you for 1 hour or on the phone or in person. There needs to be more joined up approach there behind the scenes, where we can inform the clinicians and practitioners, and having a multidisciplinary is important, because in the community you won't have all those for those rates, for like the pay. Have you seen the pay for third sector? Like, you're not going to get those professionals in the community-based organisations because of the pay there, or the, again, insecure funding. You need to have the specialisms, like not just neurodivergencies, but also medical. So we won't have that. It lacks that. It needs to be more joined up, and not just. It's got its benefits, working and learning from the community, providing safe spaces for the autistic people while they're getting diagnosis, and helping them get diagnosis, but it can't just be exclusive for the community.
Thank you, Gideon.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. Good morning. I was really going to ask a question that's quite close to what's just been answered, really. And it comes back to one of the very earliest comments right at the start of the session from Matthew Day about your organisation's experience of, well, forgive me if I caught it wrongly, but it sounded as though you were saying you were being used to clear the backlog and then dropped, and that the funding was ended, and a degree of frustration around that. But at the same time, I'm hearing from witnesses that some of these voluntary sector or third sector or community-based organisations can be really, really effective at joining the dots between the different forms of support people need, at doing it in a way that's much more inclusive, and the way that we might wish that it happened in the NHS, but the NHS isn't delivering. So should we consider, should the committee consider and put questions to other witnesses in the rest of the inquiry about whether the voluntary sector should be given not just a temporary clear the backlog role, but an ongoing long-term role to deliver the assessments and the diagnosis in concert with the other forms of support, and that might be not only effective at clearing backlog, but something that works for the long term, not only something that meets people's needs for those assessment and diagnostic issues, but in a more holistic way, meets their wider needs, and also might potentially be quite a cost-effective way compared with scaling up capacity in the NHS. Is that something that we should be considering?
I don't see how it would be more cost-effective, or why it should be more cost-effective, I'd say, because I think we need the NHS clinicians to be skilled up anyway. And I don't know, I just do get very nervous about thinking about things that I feel should sit within the NHS. Not. I mean, some services kind of... it's good that we have some services doing assessments in some areas to try and reduce the awful waiting lists. But I think for me to feel that the NHS would almost... I want to say wash their hands of us, but that's how it feels. But I know that's just how it feels. You know, that at the moment I feel that neurodivergent people, we don't get free and fair access to NHS services as it is. And it almost feels like taking that out of the NHS would make it worse. It wouldn't be the right message. It would feel like we don't get to access other services and now we can't access that.
Yeah. I get the point and I share the concern. But I'm also aware that of the other evidence we've heard, especially in the previous session, that a lot of people are finding that because they don't have that access to the NHS, they're forced to go private and they're forced into debt. And it seems to me that doing this on a way that contracts externally to the NHS doesn't involve fees for individuals and families and has an agreed standard of what's being delivered so that diagnoses are recognised. It feels like it would be better than what we've got now.
I think the model at number 6 is exemplary. I think having that properly embedded model where you're able to access on one hand a professional assessment and then be sort of seamlessly streamlined into that support and that relationship is there. My concern would be that if we went down this pathway, the contracts would be picked up by the very big organisations who already have that infrastructure, who are predominantly staffed by non-neurodivergent people, much as they have years of experience, rather than, I mean, obviously there's a mix at number 6, and I think that's absolutely valid. But perhaps then, where does that leave the organisations that are actually led by and for neurodivergent people? And we know from the feedback that we get from the reporting that we do for funders that what people tell us is exactly what you said. They have in an hour they get more than they've had all of their lives somewhere else, and we're already struggling to access the funding that we need to be able to see people. So I think it would have to be very carefully thought out and managed so that it doesn't actually create a bigger problem in accessing really good quality community-based support, because it sort of prices those organisations out of the market, and that rather than that, perhaps there's that investment in building some of those organisations up so that somebody who is Muslim is able to come and see a Muslim diagnostician and then move into getting support. Because if they're not able to do that, we are a bit further forward, but we're not where we could be. So I think that it is a little bit more complex, and certainly that's something that I think realistically probably would be what would happen. And so a little bit of thinking around, well, how can we make that look a little bit differently? How can we work in partnership? How can we invest in the organisations that are working well in those local areas and working well with those communities of identity, so that they are able to do what they do better? Because we are good value for money, and I think you make a good point. It shouldn't be cheaper, because we should be getting paid a lot better. But the reality is that we're more agile. We're able to do a lot more with what we have. I mean, I last year had a team of 3 people. We ran 310 groups in 22 locations across Scotland, from Shetland to the borders, with 3 people and a team of volunteers. Nobody else can do that apart from us. We shouldn't be. Now, luckily, we've got 5 of us. So hopefully we're not all going to go off sick with exhaustion, but what we can do and the difference that makes as well, the investment, the bang for the buck, basically, because what people get in that intervention and the added value of the community that they access and the other services that sit around it is a worthwhile investment, but needs to be done carefully.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I would say it's something that should be considered, but I would share the concerns that Kobe and Lindsay have said about who's doing it, why they're doing it. I've heard of people from England. I'm not English. I am English. Who are offering online assessments as part, so offering the NHS cheaper. It's not that cheap, but it's cheaper than having someone employed in the NHS. And I worry about how robust they are sometimes and what happens at the end of that, because they're not in an area where they're going to get any post-diagnostic support. I would like to see things linked to the post-diagnostic side of it, so people aren't just getting a diagnosis and then that's it. I'm absolutely not saying we're the only ones who could do it, but I'd worry about just anyone being expected to do it because they're third sector. But I do think it's something that should be considered. It is cheaper. It shouldn't be. It's cheaper because you don't get paid as much in the third sector. But also, I do think there's a greater commitment to get it done. There's an understanding from late diagnosed autistic people that I want to get through. I want to meet people. I want to do it outside of 9 to 5 hours so that we can make sure that people can access that service. We had a lot fewer people, or hardly any, dropping out compared to the NHS because we arrange an appointment with someone rather than that they get sent a letter saying you turn up then or that's it. So I think that there's commitment, and not paying as much makes it a bit cheaper, and you can just get through more people as well, I think, because that's all you're doing, rather than that being a part of your job. I know a lot of very good NHS clinicians whose it's kind of point one of their job is the assessments, and so they're not getting to do much of it at all.
Thank you all very much. That's really helpful.
Can I say thank you for your attendance today, and a big thank you for staying past your time allocated, but I appreciate the committee really needed to hear your evidence, so thank you for staying well past the time allocated to you, and you're free to go now. The third item on our agenda today is to consider the following negative instrument: the National Health Service Coming Staffing Method, Scotland Amendment No. 2, Regulation 2025. This instrument amends the National Health Service Coming Staffing Method, Scotland Regulations 2024, to update the staffing level and professional judgment tools that must be used as a part of the Common Staffing Method for specific kinds of healthcare and provision. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered the instrument at its meeting on the 16th of September and made no recommendations in relation to the instrument. No motion to annul has so far been received in relation to this instrument. Do members have any comments? I then propose that the committee does not make any recommendations in relation to this negative instrument. Does any member disagree? Thank you. At next week's meeting, we will continue taking oral evidence as part of the committee's inquiry into autism and ADHD pathways and support. And that concludes the public part of the meeting.